Hey there. Tonight's story isn't about war, royalty, or ancient heroes. It's about rules. Really strange ones. You'll visit courtrooms where lettuce theft meant amputation, temples where swearing falsely meant your tongue might be cut out, and markets where touching the wrong item could cost you your hand. From Babylon to Egypt, from Athens to ancient China, we're diving into the quietly ridiculous logic of ancient law. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe. But only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same bizarre history. So, settle in. Put your hand where everyone can see it. And let's begin with the laws you'd definitely be breaking if you lived back then. Let us begin with a stone. Not just any stone, of course, but one that stands over 7 feet tall and looks rather like a blackened thumb. If that thumb had 282 laws etched into its surface and had spent the last few thousand years in the Louvre. This is the Code of Hammurabi, carved around 1754 BCE in ancient Babylon, under the regal direction of King Hammurabi himself, a man who, if the stone is to be believed, was chosen by the gods to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak. Which sounds terribly noble, until you begin reading what justice actually looked like under his rule. Because for Hammurabi, righteousness meant, among other things, that if a builder's house collapsed and killed the owner's son, then the builder's son would be put to death in return. No refunds, just sons. This is a legal tradition known as lex talionis, or the law of retaliation, often summed up by that famous phrase, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In Hammurabi's Babylon, this wasn't a metaphor. If you knocked out someone's tooth, the state would knock out yours. If you gouged out someone's eye, you could expect your own eye to be carefully removed, presumably by someone with very steady hands and a good understanding of symmetry. Of course, not everyone's eyes were created equal. If a nobleman gouged out the eye of another nobleman, the law required his eye be taken in return. Fair's fair. But if he gouged out the eye of a commoner, someone from the lower class, then a fine would do. A few shekels of silver, and the problem was considered solved. And if a nobleman harmed a slave, well, that was the slave owner's financial problem, not a legal one. Babylonian justice, you see, was tiered. Righteousness was a sliding scale, and your place on that scale depended on your birth. This wasn't considered cruel or unjust. On the contrary, it was orderly, predictable. And in a world of floods, famine, and suspicious goat entrails, predictability was comfort. But let us return to the stele. Imagine yourself standing in the hot sun of Mesopotamia, staring up at this stone monument. At the top, you'd see a carving of King Hammurabi himself receiving the law from Shamash, the god of justice and the sun. Shamash is seated, holding a rod and a ring, divine symbols of authority, while Hammurabi stands obediently, like a schoolboy being handed a very long assignment. Below this scene, the laws begin. Not alphabetically, not by topic, but in a sequence that suggests either deep wisdom or mild disorganization. Law 1 concerns false accusations of sorcery. Law 2 jumps straight into perjury. By Law 6, we're into theft. And by Law 21, we're already discussing burglars being put to death and buried at the breach point in the wall. It reads like a stern father's notebook. Part legal code, part grim to-do list. Now, one might expect the earliest legal systems to be obsessed with murder, theft, and general mayhem. And while Hammurabi's code certainly covers those topics, and covers them with particular enthusiasm for dismemberment, it also dedicates surprising space to irrigation. Yes, water channels, canals, ditches. Law 53, for example, states that if someone is too lazy to keep their dam in good repair and it breaks, flooding their neighbours' fields, then they must repay the grain lost. Fair enough. But if they can't repay the grain, they'll be sold, not sued, sold. Law 55 adds that if someone accidentally floods the fields while trying to irrigate, they must compensate the neighbours. This all sounds terribly modern until you remember that the tools used for irrigation were often little more than sticks, clay pots, and hopeful guesses. In other words, Babylonian farmers were expected to control water with the precision of civil engineers, or risk being reduced to property. There's also a law about renting oxen, and one about improperly labelling beer, and quite a few on adultery, mostly involving drowning. Which brings us neatly to the topic of wives. In Hammurabi's Babylon, marriage was a legally binding contract. It came with obligations, punishments, and, in the case of infidelity, some truly inventive consequences. Law 129 is especially famous. It states, if a man's wife is caught lying with another man, they shall bind them and throw them into the water. Presumably not a spa. However, there's a small but revealing clause. If the husband decides to pardon his wife, the drowning can be cancelled. A sort of by royal permission on a local scale. The law didn't say why she might be pardoned. Perhaps she baked excellent bread. Or perhaps he didn't fancy being single again. But the power lay with him. Still, Babylonian law wasn't entirely without nuance. If a woman was neglected, if her husband left her without food or care, she could file for separation and, if proven, return to her father's house. Even here, control and hierarchy were everything. She could leave, but only with permission, and only to a sanctioned destination. Another favourite is Law 218, which concerns surgeons. If a doctor performed a major operation on a nobleman and the patient died, the doctor's hands were to be cut off. Not sued, not disbarred, just handless. It's worth noting that this applied only if the patient was a nobleman. If the doctor killed a commoner, the penalty was a fine. And if the patient was a slave, the doctor had to pay the owner for the value of the slave. In Babylon, even death had market value, and a very specific receipt. There are also a few laws that feel oddly domestic, even faintly bureaucratic. Law 196. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. Law 197. If he breaks another man's bone, they shall break his bone. Law 198. If he destroys the eye of a commoner, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. The pattern becomes clear. Babylonian justice was deeply transactional. If you had enough silver, you could buy forgiveness. If you didn't, your body paid the price. This created a world in which justice wasn't blind. It was rather exacting in its bookkeeping. Now, before we judge too harshly, we must remember the environment from which these laws emerged. Babylonian society was complex, hierarchical, and deeply religious. The gods were believed to oversee every aspect of life, from harvests to sickness, to the precise width of your neighbour's boundary stone. Law was not simply about fairness. It was about maintaining cosmic order. Punishment wasn't vengeance. It was alignment. The idea was not to comfort the victim, but to rebalance the moral universe. If someone stole a goat and the punishment wasn't administered, the gods might take offence and punish the entire community. Better to drown one adulteress than suffer a drought. And so, these laws, written in cuneiform, carved onto basalt, and displayed in the public square, weren't just practical guidelines. They were theological architecture. Every verdict, every amputation, every flooded field was part of a divine ledger. And woe betide the man who tampered with it. Hammurabi himself ends the code with a long and rather self-congratulatory warning. He invokes the gods, calls himself the King of Justice, and curses anyone who dares alter his words. May the great gods of heaven and earth tear out his seed, judge his case, and destroy his land. Strong feelings for a man who just wanted people to label their beer properly. As you drift off now, imagine a world where every disagreement, from land disputes to bad medical outcomes, was handled by reference to a stone monument, where class decided your value, and the gods were assumed to be extremely interested in your plumbing problems. It was orderly, yes. Fair? That's another matter. But above all, it was strangely human, trying in its own severe way to bring justice to a world of chaos. One eyeball at a time. Sleep well. If Babylon gave us laws carved in stone, then Sumer gave us something even more impressive. Clay tablets, hundreds of them, baked to permanence by the Mesopotamian sun, inscribed in cuneiform, those neat wedge-shaped marks made by pressing a stylus into soft clay, and quietly catalogued by scribes who, one assumes, were very good at sitting still. We're going back further now, to around 2100 BCE, to the dusty sun-baked city of Ur, in what is now southern Iraq. This was a time before alphabets, before coins, and, crucially, before the concept of separating gossip from crime. The Sumerians, though overshadowed in textbooks by their Babylonian successors, were rather remarkable. They invented writing, or at least a version of it. They built cities with irrigation, organized temples with priests, and filled their lives with contracts, inventories, and the deeply held belief that everything, from land boundaries to whispers behind closed doors, needed documentation. They also gave us one of the earliest legal codes we know of, the Code of Ur-Nammu. Written nearly 3 centuries before Hammurabi, it is both more lenient and somehow more peculiar. And it begins, as so many things did in ancient Sumer, with the gods. King Ur-Nammu of Ur, the man behind the code, claimed divine authority, not modestly. His law code opens by declaring that the gods Nana and Utu appointed him to bring peace, order, and justice. One imagines Utu, the sun god, sighing as he handed down a to-do list that included regulating the behaviour of millers and resolving donkey thefts. Ur-Nammu's laws, though fewer in number than Hammurabi's, were striking in their own way. There were no eyes for eyes here, no sons executed for the sins of their fathers. Instead, punishments tended to involve silver fines, physical punishment, or occasionally death by drowning, though that last one was reserved for special occasions, usually involving adultery. It all starts out quite sensibly. If a man commits a murder, he shall be killed. directer. No arguments, but then it turns quickly into the realm of the oddly specific. If a man divorces his first-time wife, he shall pay her 1 mina of silver. If a man is accused of sorcery, and it is not proven, he shall pay 3 shekels. What's striking is not just the punishment, but the precision. The law doesn't say the man is innocent of sorcery, just that it wasn't proven. And in that lack of proof lies a fine, a sort of penalty for being suspiciously magical. This brings us neatly to the Sumerian obsession with slander. The legal code suggests that gossip was not a hobby. It was a prosecutable offence. Whispering about someone's conduct could land you in court, or worse, in a canal. The Sumerians seemed deeply concerned with what people said, how they said it, and whether a third party might be quietly listening through a curtain of reeds. The gods, after all, were always watching. And if they weren't, your neighbours certainly were. In fact, one surviving fragment of a Sumerian legal text describes a woman accusing another of having killed her husband. The accused is forced to undergo a trial by ordeal, a divinely supervised dunking. If she drowns, well, divine judgment. If she floats, she's innocent. Some scholars have debated the logistics. Did they tie weights to the accused? Was there a ritual involved? Did the gods prefer a gentle toss or a ceremonious shove? The tablets are silent, but the logic is clear. The river was the courtroom. The gods were the jury. The outcome? Wet. But not all laws were so dramatic. Many were eerily bureaucratic, like entries from a very ancient insurance manual. If a man lets his ox stray, and it gores another man, the owner shall pay compensation. Oxen were rather the SUVs of Sumer. Heavy, slow to turn, and occasionally deadly. And so they were regulated. Their behaviour, their owners' responsibilities, even their breeding. Ox-related incidents were no laughing matter. Other laws covered false weights, tampering with boundary stones, and the proper payment for wet nurses. A profession taken so seriously that there were legal contracts for how long a child should be breastfed, and how much milk was owed daily. One gets the impression that Sumerian lawyers were extremely good at paperwork, and that justice was measured not just in fairness, but in volume. How much milk, how many shekels, how deep the canal. Now let's pause for a moment and imagine a courtroom in Ur. There is no jury, no powdered wigs. The judge is a high-ranking official, perhaps even the king's representative, sitting on a stone bench in the temple courtyard. Scribes lean nearby with wax tablets and styluses. The accused stands barefoot, nervous, possibly clutching an offering. The crime, allegedly cursing the neighbour's sheep. The punishment? Depending on the outcome, perhaps 10 shekels. Perhaps drowning. Perhaps a firm warning and a recommendation to be less dramatic in the future. It's hard to say. One surviving case tells us of a woman falsely accused of adultery. She swears her innocence. Her accuser insists otherwise. There are no witnesses, so the temple priest recommends a trial by water. Again. Water, in Shimmer, was not just for bathing. It was divine. It connected the world of the living with the realm of the gods. To submit someone to water was to invite judgment from beyond. It's hard to imagine the accused finding this particularly comforting. Even contracts of adoption were strictly regulated. If you adopted a son and he displeased you, you couldn't simply unadopt him. You needed a valid reason. Just as in a land dispute, you might need witnesses, written agreements, and a clay tablet or two to prove your side. Which brings us to an important point. The Sumerians loved writing things down. They wrote down court cases. They wrote down contracts, receipts, prayers, hymns, astronomical data, and, when time allowed, complaints about copper shipments. Yes, we have those. Their legal culture was not just about punishment. It was about record keeping. The written word, they believed, was more reliable than memory, especially when memory might be swayed by bribes, wine, or the persuasive powers of one's mother-in-law. So they recorded everything. And in doing so, they gave us one of the earliest pictures of a civilization trying, not always successfully, to regulate itself. Another point of interest is the uneven severity of punishments. Murder, death, adultery, death or drowning, theft, fines, unless it involved temple property, in which case also death, breaking a dam or floodgate, reparations and possible servitude. But lying about someone, even without proof, could carry just as harsh a penalty. This wasn't about protecting truth so much as protecting social cohesion. The Sumerians lived in close quarters, in dense urban clusters. Gossip could erode trust, and trust was vital when your neighbour's goat had access to your barley. If the gods wanted justice, the Sumerians wanted quiet. Nowhere is this clearer than in their language. They didn't use a word for law as we know it. Instead, they had terms for verdicts, decrees, and judgments, usually connected to temple activity. Law wasn't a separate institution. It was an extension of divine will, administered by scribes and priests on behalf of the gods. And those gods had very particular preferences. They disliked disorder. They hated arrogance. And they were surprisingly attentive to how many jars of grain one paid for. As for prisons, there weren't many. Most punishments were immediate. You were fined, flogged, mutilated, or drowned. Very efficient. Long-term imprisonment didn't yet exist as a widespread tool of justice. Why feed someone for months when a canal and a rope were faster? That said, it wasn't all brutality. Many fines were modest. Compensation could be negotiated. In some cases, the goal was reconciliation, not revenge. And there's even evidence of legal forgiveness, a practice where wrongs were formally forgiven and recorded. Not out of mercy, but to maintain balance, so the gods wouldn't become cranky. So, to summarise, ancient Sumer was a world of contracts, fines, trials by water, suspicious oxen, and the ever-present threat of divine opinion. Justice was not blind. It was written in clay, witnessed by scribes, and administered by people who genuinely believed that gossip could bring down a city. The law was not about fairness, it was about balance, about making sure everyone stayed in their place, kept their oxen tethered, and didn't accuse their neighbours of witchcraft without cause. And if you must lie, at least do it quietly. As you drift off now, picture the bustling city of Ur at dusk, the mud brick homes, the ziggurat towering in the distance, the scribes finishing up their tablets before the oil lamps burn low. Somewhere, a man is arguing with his brother over a stolen goat. A priest listens. A judgment is passed. A fine is paid. Order is restored. And the gods for the moment are pleased. Sleep well. Let us now travel to a land of sun, sand, and extremely patient civil servants. Ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, papyrus scrolls, and the firm belief that even death required documentation. Unlike the Babylonians, who carved their laws in stone, and the Sumerians, who baked them into clay, the Egyptians preferred to keep their laws a little more flexible. There is, as it turns out, no single surviving Egyptian law code, no equivalent of Hammurabi's stele looming in the town square. But that's not to say the Egyptians lacked laws. Far from it. They had oaths, court proceedings, contracts, judges, tax assessors, and enough legal scribes to make even the most modest dispute feel like a minor festival. They just didn't feel the need to engrave every rule on basalt. Instead, they trusted in a concept far older and far more sacred than statute. They called it Mayat. Mayat was many things. A goddess, a principle, a feather. She represented truth, balance, justice, and the order of the cosmos. Pharaohs swore to uphold Ma'at. Judges were said to administer it. And at the end of your life, when your heart was weighed in the Hall of Two Truths, it was Ma'at's feather they used as the counterbalance. If your heart was lighter than the feather, congratulations, eternal paradise awaited. If not, you were devoured by a demoness with a crocodile head and a lion's backside. So no pressure. But what Ma'at meant in practical terms was this. The Egyptians preferred ethical harmony over legal rigidity. Their justice system was based less on written codes and more on what seemed fair, appropriate, or divinely pleasing at the time, which, as you might imagine, made for some fascinating court cases. Consider a simple dispute. Two farmers are arguing over a boundary stone. One accuses the other of moving it during the night to steal land. There is no GPS, no satellite imaging, no surveyor with a clipboard. Just a few dusty witnesses and a stone that's clearly not where it used to be. The case is brought before a local official, perhaps a village mayor, perhaps a provincial governor. The official listens, questions the parties, perhaps consults a record keeper. Then he renders a verdict. Was it fair? Reasonable? Consistent with Ma'at? That was the goal. Not legal consistency, but cosmic correctness. Of course, not everything could be handled by philosophy and feathers. For larger cases, there were official judges called Sashemu. They were often priests, scribes, or royal appointees. Men of learning, which in Egypt meant men who could write without smearing ink across their linen kilts. Judges worked in temples, courts, and administrative buildings. They were known for their calm demeanour, extensive memory, and ability to keep a straight face while listening to a goat herder accuse his neighbour of casting spells on his sheep. Some trials were held in public, others in quiet chambers, and nearly all of them required paperwork. The Egyptians, more than almost any other ancient civilization, believed in the power of writing. They wrote everything down. Contracts, confessions, wills, marriage agreements, even grain loans, complete with interest tables and repayment terms. In one surviving case, a man defaulted on a barley loan and tried to flee the region. He was caught, dragged back to court, and ordered to repay the debt plus one additional donkey for his trouble. Justice, as always, had a price, and sometimes it had hooves. Egyptian law was especially meticulous when it came to property. Land could be inherited, bought, leased, and gifted. Boundaries were marked, catalogued, and updated with painful regularity by scribes known as inspectors of fields, men whose job involved walking through hot sand with measuring cords and extremely precise expressions. Property ownership was not reserved for men either. Women in Egypt could own land, file lawsuits, and manage their own estates. They could divorce, sue for alimony, and pass property to their children, rights that wouldn't be guaranteed in Europe for another 3,000 years. However, don't let this give you the impression of utopia. This was still a society with strata, obligations and expectations, and gods helped the person who upset the balance. Take, for example, the case of false testimony. Lying under oath was not just a legal offence, it was a cosmic insult, a disruption of Ma'at. Penalties ranged from fines and flogging to more creative punishments. In one recorded case, a man who falsely accused another of theft was sentenced to receive 100 blows with a stick and to have his nose cut off. Now, we can assume that this punishment was not metaphorical. Ancient Egyptian law, while poetic, was rarely symbolic when it came to noses. In other cases, liars were exiled, enslaved, or publicly shamed. And in one remarkable record from the New Kingdom, a man is punished not just for lying, but for causing another man to lie. It appears that enabling dishonesty was also a crime. Then there were the oath ceremonies. In serious legal matters, parties would be required to swear truthfulness in the name of a deity, usually Ra or Osiris. The ritual was solemn. Candles, incense, possibly a priest nearby, frowning gently. Breaking such an oath wasn't just perjury, it was blasphemy. In a society where the afterlife depended on the purity of your soul, lying in court could condemn you in both worlds, the here and the hereafter. Imagine testifying about a stolen cartwheel and realizing that one fib could result in your heart being fed to a crocodile demon 40 years later. It rather encourages honesty. Legal punishments varied widely depending on the offence. Minor crimes, such as drunken brawls, slander, or minor theft, might result in whipping, often 50 to 100 lashes, administered with a rod made of tamarisk or palm. Not quite a feather. Major crimes, like murder, temple theft, or rebellion, could lead to execution, dismemberment, or, for particularly audacious offenders, burning alive. One famous decree, issued by Pharaoh Ramses III, involved a conspiracy by members of his own harem. When it was discovered that they had plotted his murder using magic and poisoned figs, the accused were subjected to ritual trials, forced suicides, and in some cases, public mutilation. Even in paradise, one must be wary of poisoned fruit. Now let us turn briefly to inheritance law, that quiet battlefield where families came to quarrel in the name of tradition. Egyptian wills were binding legal documents. Parents could divide their property among children, favour one heir over another, or, in a particularly popular twist, disinherit them entirely. In one surviving letter, a father writes to his son, "Because you have vexed me, I have given your house to your brother." A legal and emotional blow, delivered via scribe. Children could contest wills, but the process required witnesses, bribes, and, ideally, the good graces of a sympathetic priest. There is also evidence of parents threatening to invoke Ma'at against their children, a kind of divine guilt-tripping. One of the most curious legal artifacts from ancient Egypt is something known as the negative confession. It is not a legal testimony per se, but it reads like one, and it gives us extraordinary insight into how the Egyptians saw justice not just as a public system, but as a private ledger between soul and eternity. When the dead appeared before Osiris in the afterlife, they would recite 42 declarations, one for each judge of the underworld. I have not stolen. I have not committed murder. I have not told lies. I have not eavesdropped. I have not shut my ears to truth. The list goes on. In essence, this was a spiritual deposition, a soul pleading its case, not in front of a jury, but in front of eternity. And what's most astonishing is that it reflects the very same concerns found in the real-world courts. Theft, slander, dishonesty, disrespect. Justice, it seems, was a lifelong performance, reviewed not just by judges, but by gods, and perhaps by your great-uncle, who kept receipts. To tie things together, we should note that Egyptian law was rarely about deterrence through cruelty. Rather, it was about maintaining mayat, the balance of things. Disputes were to be resolved quietly. Contracts were to be honoured, and justice, whenever possible, was meant to be restorative. And if that failed, well, at least it was written down. As you settle now, imagine a gentle breeze over the Nile, a courtroom with reed mats, oil lamps flickering, and the soft scratching of a scribe's pen. A farmer pleads his case. The official nods, adjusts his linen robe, and passes judgment. In the distance, the statue of Ma'at watches silently, a feather atop her head, a scale in her hand. Everything must be in balance, even the law. Sleep well. The ox was, quite literally, allowed to snack on the job. Yet in contrast, the legal penalties for moral or theological crimes were severe. Adultery, death. Blasphemy, death. Worshipping other gods, death. Sorcery, death. Cursing one's parents, also death. The law could be shockingly absolute, but always it claimed to serve the same purpose, to maintain holiness within the community. It wasn't all fire and brimstone. There were moments of surprising legal gentleness. Consider the cities of refuge, 6 designated towns where someone guilty of manslaughter, not murder, could flee. If they'd killed accidentally, say a flying axe head during a wood-cutting mishap, they could stay in the city under protection until the high priest died. Only then could they return home. The symbolism here is quietly poetic. The death of the high priest reset the ledger. A communal pardon. You might not get off scot-free, but you weren't condemned either. And then naturally there were laws that seem oddly specific. Take this gem from Deuteronomy. If 2 men are fighting, and the wife of one intervenes by grabbing the other man's private parts, you shall cut off her hand. Show no pity. Deuteronomy 25:11-12. One imagines this was not a common occurrence, but the fact that it required legal commentary suggests at least one memorable incident. Also from Deuteronomy. When you build a new house, make a parapet for your roof, so that you may not bring blood upon your house if anyone falls from it. 22.8. It's the world's oldest known building safety code, and honestly, rather sensible. Some laws dealt with animals. Do not plough with an ox and a donkey yoked together. If you find a bird's nest, let the mother go, that it may go well with you. There's something almost tender in these, a reminder that even in a rigid legal system, mercy extended downward, to the birds, to the labouring beasts, to the forgotten. The law wasn't only about punishing wrongs, it was about shaping a nation of conscience. The year of Jubilee was perhaps the most radical idea of all. Every 50th year, land was returned to its original owners. Debts were cancelled, slaves were released. It was a cosmic reboot. The land, said God, belonged to him, not to the people. They were tenants, and their fortunes were not to be hoarded across generations. Whether the Jubilee was ever fully practiced is debated, but its inclusion tells you everything about the legal imagination of ancient Israel. There were also rules for warfare, holidays, architecture, debt collection, and even neighbourly disputes. One law states that if your neighbour's ox falls into your uncovered pit, you must repay him. Another says that if someone borrows your cloak overnight, you must return it by sundown, since it may be his only blanket. It's legal philosophy as moral empathy, structured, yes, but deeply human, and all of it built on a foundation of divine partnership. In court, capital cases required 2 or more witnesses. False witnesses were punished with the same penalty they sought for the accused. If they tried to frame someone for a crime deserving death, they were executed in return. Justice was not only about truth, it was about responsibility. To accuse was to take on weight. You could not whisper a slander and walk away untouched. As you lie back now, picture a quiet village in ancient Judah. The sun has set, fires are out, the pots have been scrubbed. There's no travel, no hammering, no gossip. The Sabbath has begun. A family sits silently under an open sky. A scribe records the week's final measurements. A priest tucks away his scroll. And the law, as ever, rests, not abolished, not forgotten, just waiting, like the 7th day itself. Sleep well. Let us now venture into the arid hills of the ancient Near East, into a world defined not by city walls or irrigation canals, but by covenant. A world where the legal system wasn't just a set of rules. It was a divine relationship, inked in fire, thunder, and stone tablets. This is the world of ancient Israel, a society whose laws were written not by kings or senates, but by the very hand of God, or so it was believed. Laws that governed not just theft and murder, but rest days, dietary habits, mildew outbreaks, and the occasional goat in the wrong yard. You'll forgive the tone of quiet disbelief. But once we're finished here, you might understand why even a hardened Babylonian judge would raise an eyebrow at what passed for everyday legislation among the ancient Hebrews. And at the centre of it all, the Sabbath, a day so sacred, even sticks were a matter of life and death. Let's begin at the beginning, or near enough. According to the book of Exodus, Moses received the law from God atop Mount Sinai. It was not a subtle event. There was lightning, there was fire, there was a cloud, and a voice like thunder, and a mountain that trembled. And then, just like that, law was born. The first 10 were engraved in stone, but that was only the preface. What followed, woven through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, was a vast and intricate system. 613 commandments, or mitzvot, governing nearly every aspect of Hebrew life. Many of them made moral sense. Do not steal. Do not murder. Honour your parents. That sort of thing. But others took a more specific turn. Do not wear garments of wool and linen woven together. Do not sow your field with 2 kinds of seed. Do not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. It was law as lifestyle, as identity, as theology you could taste, wear, and smell. Every rule had a reason, even if that reason was known only to God. The Sabbath was not merely a break from labour. It was a legal obligation, ranked 4th among the 10 commandments, placed even above murder and adultery. 6 days shall you labour and do all your work, but the 7th is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. Now you might ask, what exactly counted as work? Surely one could stretch a little, sweep a corner, light a candle. Number absolutely not. Lighting a fire was prohibited. Gathering food was forbidden. Even walking too far was frowned upon. In Numbers 15, a man was caught gathering sticks on the Sabbath. Sticks, not trees, not furniture, just sticks. He was brought before Moses. The community waited while Moses inquired of God, and God said, in no uncertain terms, "He shall be put to death." So the people took him outside the camp and stoned him. You begin to understand why ancient Israelites planned their firewood collection very carefully on Fridays. Hebrew law didn't merely legislate behaviour, it shaped identity. The Israelites were to be a people apart, set aside for a divine purpose. Everything about their way of life, from the food they ate to the way they harvested fields, reflected that calling. "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." Leviticus 19:2. This was the driving force behind the dietary laws, the purity laws, and the general refusal to mix, blend, or hybridize anything, including seeds, animals, garments, or holidays. The kashrut laws, what was kosher, were intricate and serious. No pork, no shellfish, no mixing meat and dairy, no eating animals that hadn't been slaughtered properly, no consuming blood. It wasn't just about health or hygiene, it was about obedience, about internalizing the law through routine. You weren't just following a rule, you were aligning yourself with divine order 3 times a day. Then there were the purity laws, and these, frankly, deserved their own scroll. Becoming unclean was not a sin, but it did render you temporarily unfit for participation in the community or temple rituals. Causes included touching a corpse, giving birth, having certain skin diseases, or even just having sex. The solution? Bathing, waiting, and often sacrifices. Priests were trained to inspect skin conditions in detail. Leviticus provides a suspiciously thorough set of diagnostic guidelines. If the hair in the sore has turned white, if the raw flesh appears in it, if it spreads over the body. One can imagine the priest peering at someone's arm, murmuring, "That looks suspiciously scaly," and immediately declaring them unclean for 7 days. It wasn't personal. It was theological dermatology. Justice in Hebrew law could be both compassionate and utterly uncompromising. There were provisions to protect the poor. Fields were not to be harvested to the edges. Forgotten sheaves were to be left for the orphan and the stranger. Debts were forgiven every 7th year. Slaves were freed on a schedule. Even livestock got a break. Do not muzzle the ox when it treads the grain. Deuteronomy 25:4. If you've ever felt nervous about jury duty, take comfort. At least your fate doesn't rest on the behaviour of a chicken. In ancient Greece and Rome, justice was both a public performance and a divine negotiation. You didn't just consult witnesses, you consulted omens. The gods, after all, had opinions too, about lawsuits, about treaties, and occasionally about poultry. The Greeks gave us the concept of democracy, and with it, the courtroom drama. Not quite the gavel and robes variety, but something more theatrical. Hundreds of jurors, a lot of shouting, and very little concern for calm deliberation. The Romans, by contrast, gave us legal infrastructure, a code-based system with trained magistrates, professional advocates, and an obsessive love for categories. Theft wasn't just theft. It was furtum manifestum, caught in the act, furtum nec manifestum, not caught, and so on. Yet beneath this legal polish lay a system just as curious, superstitious, and oddly specific as anything in Babylon or Judea. Let's begin with a pig. In both Greece and Rome, animals could be put on trial. Yes, you heard correctly. If a pig knocked over a statue, a goat damaged sacred property, or a dog barked at the wrong priest, the creature might be captured, tried in a proper court, and, if found guilty, executed. Not because animals were moral agents, but because their offence had disturbed the cosmic balance. In Athens, the Areopagus court, a hilltop tribunal of elite citizens, once tried and condemned a statue for falling on a man and killing him. The statue was then ceremonially tossed into the sea. In Rome, bees that produced honey in a temple were declared public property. If they stung someone during a religious procession, legal questions were raised. Was it divine punishment, or just bad luck? You might think this quaint. The ancients, however, took it very seriously. Law was not just about human behaviour. It was about order, and order extended to animals, objects, and omens. The Greeks were especially fond of public trials. A typical Athenian court might have 201 to 501 jurors, chosen by lottery, paid a modest wage, and often older men with time on their hands. There were no lawyers as we know them. Each litigant spoke for themselves, though wealthy citizens might hire a ghostwriter to craft a convincing speech. Time was strictly controlled. A water clock, called a clepsydra, ensured each speaker had a fair turn. When the water ran out, so did your argument. And the subjects of trial? Well, they varied. One man was tried for stealing grapes, another for seducing a flute girl under false pretenses. Socrates, famously, was tried for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the city. He lost and was given a choice between exile or drinking hemlock. Ever the philosopher, he chose the hemlock. The method of voting was simple. Jurors dropped bronze discs into urns, one for conviction, one for acquittal. Majority ruled, no appeals. It was loud, chaotic, and often deeply personal, but it was justice. Or at least Athens' best attempt at it. The Romans, meanwhile, took a more procedural approach. Their laws were laid out in a formal code, the 12 Tables, first inscribed around 450 BCE. It was a response to popular demand. Plebeians wanted to know the laws, rather than rely on patricians who conveniently remembered them in court. The 12 Tables covered debt, property, marriage, funerals, inheritance, assault, slavery. They were, in many ways, stunningly detailed. Table 3, for example, states that if a debtor doesn't pay, the creditor may chain him for 60 days. After that, he may sell him or kill him. And if there are multiple creditors, they may cut the debtor into pieces, and no one shall complain if the pieces are unequal. Whether this was metaphorical or not remains, mercifully, unclear. Roman law also included strangely ceremonial procedures. To transfer property, early Romans used a process called mancipatio, which involved 5 witnesses, a set of bronze scales, and a formal declaration. It looked less like a sale and more like a ritual sacrifice. Wills had to be read aloud before 7 witnesses. A wrong word, or a stammer, could render the document void. Even marriages were legal ceremonies involving symbolic cakes, hand-holding, and an agreement that the bride would share in all matters religious and domestic. There were laws for everything, including, quite literally, how to sneeze in public. Romans had a unique interest in omens, especially in politics. Before major decisions, especially declarations of war or the founding of new colonies, augurs were consulted. These were religious officials trained in the ancient art of bird watching, not for leisure, for omens they would release sacred chickens and observe which way they flew, how they ate, and whether they clucked with approval. If the chickens refused to eat, the gods were displeased. If they ate too eagerly, the gods were suspiciously enthusiastic. Once, before a naval battle, the chickens refused to peck. The general, irritated, tossed them overboard, saying, "If they won't eat, let them drink." He lost the battle, and possibly his job. Law and religion, you see, were not separate. They were braided together like a rope you wouldn't dare untie. Let's return to Athens for a moment. The Greeks had a legal charge known as hubris, not pride in the modern sense, but arrogant behaviour intended to humiliate someone. If a wealthy man insulted a poorer citizen in public, he could be prosecuted. In one surviving case, a man was fined for slapping another citizen at a dinner party and making rude jokes afterward. The idea wasn't just to punish violence, it was to prevent social decay. A society couldn't function if the powerful mocked the weak, so they made cruelty a crime. It was, in some ways, surprisingly modern. In others, less so. There was also the Athenian punishment known as ostracism. Once a year, citizens could vote to exile someone they believed was becoming too powerful or dangerous to the democracy. If the person received enough votes, written on pieces of pottery called ostraca, they were banished for 10 years. No trial, no appeal. It wasn't meant as punishment. It was more like preventative maintenance. Imagine being exiled for being a little too popular. Roman law, for all its structure, could be profoundly unequal. A patrician who killed a slave might pay a fine. A slave who struck a master could be crucified. A noble woman caught in adultery might be quietly divorced. A common woman? Likely stoned, or worse. And yet, there were moments of bizarre logic. Take, for instance, the law on theft by night. If you caught a thief breaking into your house at night, you could kill him without consequence. But if it was daytime, and there was enough light to identify him, you had to call for help before taking action. The law seems to imply that murder is fine, as long as you can't see the thief's face. In both cultures, torture was legal, but usually only applied to slaves. In Rome, a slave's testimony was considered valid only if extracted under torture. Otherwise, it was assumed they might lie to protect their master. This created a strange system in which truth had to be beaten out of someone before it counted. There were also legal penalties for sorcery, necromancy, and cursing your neighbour with wax figurines, a surprisingly common offence. Inscriptions have been found listing the names of rival charioteers, buried in graves with curses attached. The ancient equivalent of sabotaging someone's fantasy football team. And then there's the matter of funerals. In both Greece and Rome, the law regulated how loud, long, and luxurious a funeral could be. Excessive wailing, fined. Too many flute players, also fined. Romans in particular had laws about how many mourners you could hire. Yes, professional mourners were a thing, and yes, they were regulated. The goal was to prevent social competition from becoming theatrical grief. A humble baker shouldn't feel ashamed that his funeral didn't include 12 sobbing women and a chariot. Legal education was also taken seriously. In Rome, aspiring advocates studied under jurists, men like Gaius, Ulpian, and Cicero, learning not just laws, but rhetoric, gesture, and courtroom performance. Cicero once wrote that a good legal speech should include an introduction to win sympathy, a narration of facts, a statement of the case, refutation of the opponent's argument, a conclusion that stirs emotion, in other words, law as theatre, the courtroom as stage. One wonders how often jurors were actually persuaded, and how often they were simply impressed. As you drift now toward rest, picture the agora of Athens. A man stands before a crowd, defending himself in a case of olive theft. His voice shakes, the water clock drips, the jurors whisper. A pigeon lands nearby, possibly offering commentary. Or perhaps imagine a Roman basilica, columns soaring, magistrates in togas, a young scribe furiously copying down testimony while trying not to yawn. In the corner, someone releases a chicken to see which way it turns. And justice, ever ceremonial, ever subjective, unfolds again. Somewhere between logic and omen, law and luck, speech and silence, sleep well. Let us now drift eastward, toward the banks of the Ganges. The air is thick with incense and monsoon mist. Somewhere a conch shell is blown. In the distance, a temple bell rings. You are in ancient India, where justice was not just a matter of law, but of cosmic harmony. Here the law was called Dharma, a word so expansive it defies direct translation. It meant duty, righteousness, moral order, and social obligation all at once. Dharma governed how one should speak, eat, marry, pray, rule, and, yes, how one should be punished for stealing another man's cow. You see, in ancient India, a crime wasn't merely illegal. It was a violation of the universal order, a fracture in the great cosmic rhythm, something to be corrected, not just for society's sake, but for the sake of karma, reincarnation, and one's position in the next life. It's hard to overstate just how layered this legal system was. Because if you stole a loaf of bread in Babylon, they fined you. If you stole it in Rome, they might beat you. But in ancient India, they asked what caste you belonged to, whether you'd bathed that morning, how pure your soul was, and whether the bread had been offered to a priest. Then they decided your punishment. The most famous legal text from ancient India is the Manusmriti, also known as the Laws of Manu. Believed to have been compiled somewhere between 200 BCE and 200 CE, it wasn't technically a legal code. It was more like a theological instruction manual for society, a guide for how humans ought to behave if they hope to avoid spiritual disaster. Manu, the mythical first man and lawgiver, opens his treatise with due flair. This is the law that was spoken by the self-existent creator to Manu, and by Manu to the sages, which is frankly a rather strong introduction. It also tells you everything about how this law was seen, not as human opinion, but as divine instruction. And what follows is, by turns, beautiful, bewildering, and utterly rigid. Central to the system was Varna, the caste order. There were 4 official castes: Brahmins, priests and scholars, Kshatriyas, warriors and rulers, Vaishyas, merchants and landowners, Shudras, servants and labourers. And beneath these, the untouchables, those outside the caste system entirely. Later known as Dalits, these individuals perform tasks considered spiritually polluting: tanning leather, handling corpses, cleaning latrines. Now, here's the critical point. Your caste determined your legal status, not your innocence, not the nature of your crime, just your caste. If a Brahmin and a Shudra committed the same offence, their punishments were, how shall we put it, very different. If a Brahmin stole, he might pay a fine and recite some hymns. If a Shudra stole, he could be branded, mutilated, or enslaved. If a Brahmin murdered someone, perhaps a pilgrimage, some penance. Maybe fasting for a month. If a Shudra merely insulted a Brahmin, he could have his tongue cut out. This wasn't seen as inequality, it was order. Each caste had its dharma, its role, and punishment was about preserving that hierarchy. To challenge it was to challenge the cosmic design, and the cosmos, as we've seen, doesn't appreciate being questioned. There were even fines indexed to caste. Manusmriti 8.267 lays it out plainly. The king shall inflict punishment according to the caste of the offender. In other words, there was no such thing as equal under the law. A Brahmin's body, according to Manu, was sacred. To harm it was to defile the vessel of knowledge. To harm a Shudras? Well, less so. One might argue it was a legal system designed by priests for priests. But the logic, if one can call it that, was cosmic accountability. You were born into your role because of your karma. The law didn't aim to elevate you. It aimed to help you perform your role better, so that perhaps you'd do better in the next life. The legal distinctions weren't just about class. They extended to gender, ritual purity, and intention. For example, if a man of lower caste had intimate relations with a Brahmin woman, he could be executed. If a Brahmin man seduced a lower caste woman, he might be fined or forgiven altogether if it was by mutual consent. You begin to see the pattern. Women too had a specific legal role, to serve father, husband, and son, sequentially. A woman must never be independent, says Manu. In childhood, she is dependent on her father. In youth, on her husband. In old age, on her son. Adultery laws were severe, but more so for women. A woman caught cheating might be burned alive. A man might be fined, unless he was of a lower caste, in which case, fire again. Some punishments were surprisingly symbolic. A thief might have his fingers chopped off, yes, but a liar. He might be forced to hold a red-hot iron ball. If he dropped it, he was guilty. If he held it, the gods had clearly protected him. It was trial by ordeal, a method not exclusive to India, but executed here with considerable flair. In some cases, the accused might be submerged in water. If they floated, they were innocent. If they sank, well, at least justice had been served. And then there were the fines. Manu was very fond of fines. There were tables of them, charts, algorithms really, for calculating how much one owed based on caste, intent, and timing. Stealing a cow? That'll be 10 panas. Stealing a sacred cow? 50. Stealing a cow during a festival? 100. Stealing a sacred cow during a festival after defiling yourself by eating garlic? Probably death. The laws also ventured into deeply personal territory. There were rules about what to eat, when, and with whom. Rules about how to bathe, where to spit, and which direction to face when sleeping. There were rules about naming your child. Brahmins should have names ending in Sarman, while Kshatriyas might end in Varman. Even bodily posture had rules. A student should not lie on his side during Vedic study. A penitent should sleep on the ground. A widow, well, she should ideally join her husband on the pyre, though this practice, known as sati, was debated and not universally enforced. Still, the implication was clear. Every moment of life was subject to regulation. And yet, amid this intricate lattice of caste, purity, and penance, there were glimmers of something else. For example, the concept of non-violence, ahimsa, was deeply embedded in the legal and moral tradition. Even animals had protected status. To harm a cow was far more offensive than to insult a merchant. In some cases, accidentally killing an insect could require ritual purification. And then there was the law's interest in intention. Unlike other ancient codes that focused purely on the act, Dharma law often considered the motive. Did you kill out of anger? Did you regret it? Were you under the influence of passion or alcohol? These factors mattered. The punishment might not change dramatically, but the priest overseeing your atonement would certainly take note. There was also a legal mechanism for pardon. If a king erred, or a judge issued an unfair verdict, or if a guilty man confessed with genuine remorse, certain punishments could be reduced. Repentance, fasting, pilgrimage, and charity could all cleanse sin. Not legal innocence, but karmic mitigation. In other words, a man might be guilty in court, but innocent in the eyes of the gods, if he performed the proper penance, donated cows to Brahmins, and refrained from eating onions for a year. Let us pause now to imagine a courtroom in ancient India. It's not a courtroom as you know it. It's an open-air pavilion, perhaps near a temple. The judge is a Brahmin, flanked by assistants. Nearby sits a scribe with palm leaf scrolls. A merchant has brought a complaint. His neighbour borrowed a plough and returned it broken. The accused denies it. Witnesses are called. Oaths are taken. The plough is examined. An astrologer is consulted. And then the judge gives his verdict, calm, composed, citing both precedent and scriptural verse. The accused is fined 5 panas, and advised to bathe daily, offer ghee to Agni, and stop cursing his neighbour's buffalo. Justice is served, karma is preserved, everyone goes home. As you drift into sleep, consider this. In ancient India, law was not a separate profession. It was a sacred science, a blend of ethics, theology, astrology, and agriculture. Every rule had roots in the eternal. Every punishment shaped the soul. You were not just breaking a rule. You were disturbing the rhythm of the universe. And yet, even the strictest code offered hope, through penance, through discipline, through the long road of rebirth. After all, even the lowest might be reborn a sage, and even the purest might fall, if they forgot to bathe before prayer. So sleep gently, and may your karma remain balanced. Sleep well. Welcome now to ancient China, a land of jade tablets, silent courtyards, and law codes written not with justice in mind, but with efficiency. This was not the realm of mercy or cosmic balance. This was the realm of legalism. If you lived under a legalist regime, you didn't wonder if the laws were fair. You didn't ask whether the punishment fit the crime. You asked whether the punishment would arrive before supper, and if you'd be allowed to finish eating before being arrested. Because legalism, in its purest form, wasn't about morality, it was about control. And nowhere was that philosophy more ruthlessly, gloriously, and, one must admit, strangely applied than under the Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BCE. A brief dynasty, a harsh dynasty, and one that, despite its short reign, managed to build the Great Wall, standardize the Chinese script, and bury an entire army of terracotta soldiers, all while making it illegal to own certain types of books. It was impressive, it was efficient, and it was absolutely terrifying. Let's begin with the basics. In early Chinese history, there were 3 competing philosophies: Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. Confucianism believed in moral cultivation, wise rulers, and filial piety. Taoism preferred nature, flowing with the Tao, and not worrying too much about paperwork. Legalism, on the other hand, believed that people were naturally selfish, short-sighted, and in constant need of correction. It proposed that strong laws, with strict enforcement and harsh punishments, were the only way to maintain social order. It didn't care whether people were good, it just wanted them to behave. To quote the famous legalist philosophers Han Feizi, "If rewards are high, then what the ruler wants will be quickly effected. If punishments are heavy, what he does not want will be swiftly prevented." A motivational poster, if ever there was one. Enter Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. He inherited legalist advisors, legalist ministers, and a legalist worldview that saw mercy as weakness. He abolished the feudal states, replaced noble titles with state-run prefectures, and demanded loyalty not to family or tradition, but to the law. To ensure compliance, he issued a staggering volume of uniform laws, with punishment so precise you'd think they were designed by an angry accountant. Let's take a simple example: failing to report a crime. Under Qin law, if you saw someone commit a crime and didn't immediately report it to the authorities, you were guilty by association. This included your spouse, your children, your co-workers, and, depending on the crime, your entire village. You could be flogged, tattooed, sent to forced labour, or executed. In other words, see something, say something, or else. Speaking of punishments, the Qin had a wide range. Tattooing the face with ink to mark criminals' nose or ear removal for repeat offences. Amputation of the feet for serious theft. Forced labour on imperial projects, like the Great Wall. Execution, often by beheading, for crimes against the state. Interestingly, there were no long-term prisons. The idea was to punish quickly, visibly, and permanently. Rehabilitation wasn't the goal, deterrence was. Qin officials also enforced collective punishment. If one family member broke the law, the other could be punished too. Entire communities might suffer if someone defected, deserted, or harboured fugitives. Imagine your cousin steals a chicken, and suddenly your house is knocked down, your father loses his job, and you're sent to the frontier to build a wall with no shoes. Legalism wasn't subtle, but it was effective. The law also reached into daily life. There were regulations on clothing, hairstyles, tool sizes, weights, and measures. The standardization under Qin Shi Huang was legendary. All carts had to have the same axle width. All written characters were standardized. All coins were made uniform, round with square holes. All legal documents were issued on bamboo strips of identical length. It was a vision of empire as an enormous spreadsheet, neatly aligned, colour-coded, and utterly humourless. One of the strangest features of Qin legalism was its relationship with books. In 213 BCE, fearing the spread of corrupt ideas, especially Confucian ones, Qin Shi Huang ordered the burning of all philosophical texts not directly related to legalist doctrine, agriculture, or medicine. This was not just a bonfire of the vanities. It was a full purge of intellectual memory. Scholars were arrested, libraries destroyed. Those who resisted were buried alive or forced into silence. The idea wasn't to debate ideas, it was to eliminate them. You were allowed to think quietly. But if you wrote your thoughts down, and they included the words benevolence, ritual, or Confucius, you might find yourself missing a hand or a tongue. Yet for all its brutality, the legalist system worked, at least for a while. Under Qin rule, China was unified for the first time. Roads and canals were built across provinces. Regional dialects were bridged by standardized writing. The Great Wall's earliest segments were constructed. Banditry decreased, revenue increased. The law was harsh, yes, but it was predictable. And in times of chaos, predictability can feel like safety. If you obeyed, you were left alone. If you disobeyed, the consequences were immediate. There was, bizarrely, a kind of fairness in the severity. The rules applied to everyone, on paper. Even nobles were subject to state law. And sometimes, even the emperor's family wasn't spared. Let's look at a few actual Qin laws. If two people fight and one dies, the killer is executed. If both survive, both are flogged, because clearly violence is undignified. If a person moves without state permission, their household is dissolved. If a man of age refuses to marry, he must pay a fine, marriage being considered a civic duty. If a woman is over age and unmarried, she too is fined. If a field goes untilled and you don't report it, you're fined for negligence. If you criticize a government order, you may be labelled an enemy of the state. The message was clear. Don't fight, don't wander, don't complain, and for heaven's sake, plant something. Now, not everything was punished equally. Crimes against the state, sedition, desertion, tax evasion, were punished far more severely than crimes against neighbours. You could kill a man and be sent to labour. But if you questioned the emperor, that was treason. And treason was, as ever, a crime best punished with extreme prejudice. Oddly enough, despite all this rigidity, there were rewards in the legalist system. If you reported a crime, you were rewarded. If you captured a fugitive, you were rewarded. If you turned in your own relative, you were awkwardly thanked and rewarded. The system ran not only on fear, but on incentive. Loyalty wasn't expected, it was engineered. Turn in a tax cheat and you might get a goat. Turn in a corrupt official and you might be promoted. It was justice by way of whistleblowing. And in a strange twist, legalism believed that the ruler should be invisible. Han Feizi advised that a good ruler should never reveal his emotions, never explain his decisions, and never speak more than necessary. The emperor, in this view, was not a man. He was an institution, a black box of power. You didn't need to know what he thought. You just needed to fear his laws. Of course, such systems rarely last forever. The Qin dynasty collapsed after just 15 years. The reasons? Crushing taxes forced labour mass executions, an unpopular heir, and ironically a lack of flexibility. When rebellion came, it came fast. People were tired of being punished for sneezing at the wrong ceremony. The Han dynasty followed and promptly tried to soften legalism with Confucian ethics. Law remained, but it was sprinkled with words like virtue and benevolence. Scholars were allowed to write again. The books returned. And the punishments, while still severe, were no longer quite so surgical. Legalism never fully disappeared. Its ideas remain embedded in administrative systems across East Asia. But pure legalism, like a steel trap, was eventually replaced with something slightly more padded. As you drift now towards sleep, imagine a town under Qin rule. The streets are quiet, too quiet. A child hurries to pull weeds before inspection. A clerk nervously measures coins with a state-approved weight. A farmer stares at the sky, wondering if planting today violates a grain quota. A patrol walks past. No one speaks. No one dares. In a small room, a scholar copies a scroll. He pauses, looks over his shoulder. and changes the word Confucius to Master C, just in case. Because in the world of legalism, silence is safety, and law is not justice. It is obedience. Sleep well. Now we travel north into the Anatolian highlands, to a land of stony plateaus, thick mud brick walls, and rather sensible people with a deep affection for cows and conditional justice. Welcome to the world of the Hittites. They're not the most famous of the ancient civilizations, wedged in history between the more dramatic Egyptians and the attention-hungry Assyrians. But the Hittites left us something wonderfully practical. A legal code that reads less like divine thunder and more like an unusually stern family handbook. Where Hammurabi was all fire and fury, an eye for an eye, the Hittites preferred to ask, "Can we settle this with a fine? Maybe a goat?" Their law code, dating from around 1650 to 1100 BCE, is a curious mix of gentleness, logic, and moments of utter bewilderment. And it tells us a great deal about what it meant to live in an ancient society that didn't try to be holy, just functional. Let's begin with what they called the Laws of the Land of Hatti, a set of about 200 laws carved onto tablets and uncovered from the ruins of Hattusa, the Hittite capital. And if Babylon's laws were engraved in stone with the fury of vengeance, the Hittite laws seem to have been revised over time, softened and updated like a well-used office memo. Take this example. Early versions of Hittite law prescribed the death penalty for certain offences, but in later versions, the death sentence is replaced with a fine, or sometimes nothing at all. You can almost hear the scribe muttering, "That does seem a bit harsh. Let's say 10 sheep instead." One of the most telling things about Hittite law is how much of it concerns animals. If someone steals your ox, they owe you 30 shekels of silver. If they steal your pig, 15 shekels. And if your dog bites someone, well, it depends. If a dog bites a man and the man dies, the owner of the dog shall give 1 slave to the family of the dead man. Not a fine, not money. A slave, which, raises questions. Why not just execute the dog? But then, perhaps the Hittites thought it fair to compensate labour for labour. A life lost, a worker returned. It's oddly specific and quietly brutal. The Hittites also had laws concerning cows in the wrong place at the wrong time. If a cow gores a man and kills him, its owner shall pay 6 shekels of silver. Not the cow's fault, apparently, just unfortunate. But if a bull mounts another man's cow without permission, the owner of the bull owes the owner of the cow a fine. Yes, even animal misconduct was a legal matter. It seems no Hittite court was too proud to hear a case about bovine boundaries. Then there's the issue of damage to property, which appears frequently. One law declares, if a man enters another man's house and breaks a pot, he shall replace the pot and give 1 shekel of silver. Very fair, very reasonable. But there's a follow-up. If a man borrows a pot and breaks it, he shall also give 1 shekel, but only if the pot was new. This tells us 2 things. The Hittites were very concerned about kitchenware. They had a robust concept of depreciation. If the pot was old, well, accidents happen. No need for a fine. But if it was new, that's on you. Pay up. It's not divine wrath. It's ancient insurance logic. There are also several laws about accidental death. If a man accidentally kills another while felling a tree, he owes a fine. If someone dies during a house collapse, the builder may owe restitution. And if someone wanders into a construction site and is injured, that's on them. In essence, be careful where you walk. There might be an unsupervised Hittite ladder around the corner. The Hittites were surprisingly invested in liability, and not just criminal, but civil. You broke it, you bought it. You caused it, you pay for it. Simple, pragmatic, occasionally weird. One law is particularly memorable. If a man bites off another man's nose, he shall pay 6 shekels of silver. This opens a number of questions. Chief among them, how often did this happen? It's the kind of law that makes you imagine a very specific, very unfortunate town hall meeting where someone says, "All right, from now on, nose biting is punishable. We've had enough." In cases involving family, Hittite law gets complicated. For example, marriage was usually arranged, dowries were exchanged, and contracts were written. A man could divorce his wife, but he owed her part of the estate, especially if she had borne children. But if the wife left on her own, and there was no abuse or adultery involved, she could lose her claim. Children could be adopted formally, and adoption was legally binding. But adopted children could not be disowned without cause. In other words, once you claimed someone as family, the law expected you to act like it. It wasn't about sentiment. It was about obligation. Hittite law also allowed women to own property, inherit land, and even run households in their husband's absence. This wasn't universal in the ancient world, and while it didn't mean full equality, it meant that a woman, particularly a widow or priestess, could exert legal agency without male supervision. There's even a record of a female estate manager appearing in court to settle a land dispute. The scribe, one imagines, didn't blink. Now, let's talk about magic. The Hittites believed in it, firmly, but they treated it not with executions and bonfires, but with laws. If you cursed someone, you might owe them a fine. If you used magic to cause disease, you'd be exiled. In fact, several laws mention purification rites, ceremonies designed to cleanse wrongdoing or misfortune caused by magical offence. The punishment wasn't always brutal. It was often ritualised, and more importantly, it was acknowledged as real. If your neighbour said you'd hexed his crops, the courts didn't ask for proof. They asked whether you'd performed the proper purification. Again, not a matter of guilt, a matter of restoring order. There are also laws about harming royal property, including palace walls. If a man climbs the palace wall without permission, he shall be killed. Fairly straightforward. One assumes the Hittites didn't appreciate casual scaling, but if a man insulted the king, he might only be fined, assuming he didn't repeat the offence. It's an interesting inversion. Act against the palace, and you die. Say something rude, and you're taxed. Apparently, the king could tolerate words more than trespass. Now, Hittite law was famous in its time for being relatively humane. Unlike the Babylonians, they rarely used the death penalty. Even serious crimes like bestiality, which in many ancient cultures was punished by death, were treated differently by the Hittites, usually with banishment. They seemed to prefer removal to revenge. If someone couldn't live properly in society, they were sent out, not killed. There are echoes here of exile as a moral quarantine. And if a slave was abused or wrongfully punished, the law demanded compensation, sometimes even freedom. One fascinating law concerns shelter. If a man arrived in your village and had no family, no job, and no land, you were expected to give him a place to sleep and some grain, not charity, Legal requirement. The Hittites understood something many societies later forgot, that poverty was a structural issue, not a moral failing, and the community bore responsibility for its vulnerable members. No one should starve in a land with rules. Now imagine, if you will, a courtroom in Hattusa. A man stands before a judge, barefoot, sunburned, holding a broken pot. He says his neighbour borrowed it, used it to cook millet, dropped it in a river, and now refuses to pay. The judge nods. A scribe unrolls a tablet. They check the pot laws. They debate its value. Was it new? Was it glazed? Did it belong to a priest? After discussion, the verdict is issued. Repay the pot, plus 1 shekel for insult. The man nods. The neighbour grumbles. Justice is served. No curses, no swords, just a pot, a rule, and a quiet agreement. The Hittite legal code isn't filled with epic punishments or divine mandates. It lacks the heavenly rhetoric of Moses or the theatrical violence of Assyria. But it is human, deeply so. These were people who understood that most crimes weren't cosmic rebellions. They were mistakes, or accidents, or quarrels over property, livestock, and misunderstandings. And their law didn't try to terrify. It tried to repair. That's what makes it strange. Not because it's alien, but because it's familiar. Surprisingly, modern. As you settle into rest, imagine the world of the Hittites. Stone houses, copper tools, pots balanced on open flames, goats arguing behind a fence, brothers arguing over land, wives arguing over goats. And in the midst of it all, a scroll, a court, a quiet voice saying, "Let's settle this fairly." Because sometimes justice isn't thunder. Sometimes it's a replacement pot, a fine of 3 shekels, and the reminder to keep your cow on your own side of the field. Sleep well. Now we turn westward, across oceans and time, into the rainforests of Mesoamerica. Here, among temples wrapped in vines and plazas carved from stone, we enter the world of the ancient Maya, a civilization of stargazers, calendar keepers, and civic recorders with a strong opinion on how to behave in public. The Maya built cities that rose from the jungle canopy like puzzles of limestone and shadow. They charted the heavens with stunning precision, predicted eclipses, played ritual ball games, and spoke over 30 languages, many of them still alive today. And, crucially for our purposes, they had laws. Not always written on stone or preserved in lengthy legal codes like Hammurabi's or the Roman 12 tables, but embedded in murals painted on pottery and remembered in the social fabric of their cities, especially when someone tried to steal cacao. Yes, cacao, the fermented bean from which chocolate is made, was more than a luxury food. In Maya society, it was currency. And if you stole it, you weren't just a thief. You were a counterfeiter, a threat to the economy, practically a walking economic crisis in sandals. To understand Maya law, one must first understand Maya society. It was hierarchical, but not without structure. At the top stood the Kuhul Ajal, the Holy Lord or King, who ruled both politically and religiously. Below him were nobles, priests, scribes, merchants, artisans, farmers, and labourers. At the bottom were war captives, debt servants, and slaves, though even they retained some legal recognition. Maya cities, such as Tikal, Copan, and Palenque, functioned as independent kingdoms. Each had its own rulers, temples, laws, and traditions. There was no single unified legal code across all Maya regions, just a shared worldview. And in that worldview, justice was about harmony. With the land, with the gods, with your neighbours. When that harmony was broken, say, by stealing another man's cacao sack, balance had to be restored. Now, about the cacao. It's easy to think of chocolate as a treat, but to the Maya, cacao was money. 5 cacao beans could buy a tamale. 10 beans could get you a turkey egg. 100 might land you a modest slave. And for a full sack of beans, you were practically a banker. Naturally, this led to, shall we say, temptation. And so cacao theft was treated with the seriousness modern societies reserve for embezzlement or counterfeiting. If you were caught tampering with cacao stores, watering down the beans, replacing them with fake husks, or stealing from market stalls, the punishment could be severe. Restitution was expected. Humiliation was common. In some cases, your hands could be publicly bound and displayed, the Maya equivalent of a social media flogging. You were not only punished for the theft, you were marked, publicly, richly, and with a strong undertone of, "Don't try this again." But justice wasn't always violent. More often, it was performative. Maya court proceedings, when they occurred, were public events. Disputes were heard by city elders or appointed judges, often nobles, who operated from designated council houses or open courtyards. These proceedings were formal, timed with the calendar, and steeped in ceremonial dress. The accused might be made to stand barefoot in front of the community, arms crossed, head bowed, not just to show shame, but to literally embody guilt. Witnesses were called, testimonies were delivered, and the final ruling was issued not just by word, but by gesture. In some regions, a staff or sceptre was held aloft to indicate that judgment had been passed. Unlike the Romans or Babylonians, the Maya placed less emphasis on codified punishment and more on restitution and repair. Let's say a man trampled his neighbour's maize field during a drunken festival. He wasn't imprisoned. He was required to repay the loss, likely with labour, maize, or cacao. If he broke a household pot during a dispute, he might need to replace it and sit outside the victim's home for a full day as a silent gesture of apology. One might call it awkward justice, but it worked. Violent crimes did exist: murder, assault, and occasionally treason. But they were relatively rare and often tied to war or political betrayal. When murder occurred, the punishment could involve execution, but only if the killer refused to offer restitution. If the victim's family accepted a settlement, land, goods, labour, the killer might go unpunished. Justice, in this world, was negotiated and deeply personal. Even in death, the community had the final say. Now it must be said, Maya law, while thoughtful in many respects, was not equal. Class mattered. Gender mattered. Bloodlines mattered. A noble caught stealing might be disgraced or fined. A peasant, possibly whipped, or worse. Women could bring complaints to court, especially in cases of domestic abuse or land disputes, but their testimonies held less weight. Widows and priestesses fared better, particularly if they managed land or temple goods, but they were the exception. And for slaves, those captured in war or born into bondage, the law was brutally transactional. They could be sold, branded, and sacrificed. Though curiously, even some slaves had legal protections if they were mistreated beyond acceptable norms. A line, however faint, existed. It was not justice as we might hope, but it was justice as they defined it. Now, about sorcery. The Maya, being excellent astronomers and expert timekeepers, also held a firm belief in supernatural influence. Curses, omens, and magical offences could carry real legal consequences. If you were accused of casting a spell on someone, say, to make their crops fail, or to cause a miscarriage, you could be brought before a council and interrogated. You might be required to undergo a purification ritual, pay a fine, or in more serious cases, be exiled. And exile was not merely geographic, it was spiritual. You were cut off from your community, your lineage, and your gods. You could be sent into the jungle, not to die necessarily, but to live outside the calendar, beyond the protection of rituals. You were no longer part of time, a fate, some believed, worse than death. One peculiar case survives in oral tradition. The tale of a man who stole cacao meant for ritual use, beans that were to be offered to the gods at the New Year festival. He was caught. He confessed. And rather than being executed or beaten, he was sentenced to stand at the edge of the central plaza, head bowed, holding the cacao sack, while children threw crushed shells at his feet. It was public. It was ceremonial. It was humiliating. And the message was clear. You do not steal from the gods. You can steal from your neighbour, and maybe negotiate. But from the gods? Not unless you enjoy being pelted by very small, very symbolic refuse. Let us talk briefly about debt. Debt in Maya society was often a matter of honour and kinship, not banks. You owed a neighbour, a priest, or a merchant, not a financial institution. Failing to repay a debt could result in indentured labour. But this wasn't always permanent. Work a season, settle your account, and go free. But if you fled your debt, if you disappeared during a planting season, then you might be declared ritually dead, struck from records, your name erased from stelae, your debts transferred to your family. To default was not just economic failure, it was social disappearance. Even timekeeping affected law. Certain days were considered inauspicious for trials, executions, or punishments. You didn't want to condemn someone on a bad date. It might anger the gods or cast a shadow on the community's fate. Some offences were postponed until a more favourable calendar alignment. Imagine telling a judge, "I know I stole the canoe, but today is 3 Ike. That's bad luck for a flogging." And the judge agrees. Now picture the scene. A man stands in a tiled plaza, watched by his neighbours. He's been accused of watering down cacao beans with roasted squash seeds, a serious offence. He does not deny it. The judge, an elder with painted face and feathered robes, listens. Witnesses speak. The market vendor describes the taste, slightly off, more squash than chocolate. The verdict: the thief must repay double the value. He must deliver 2 sacks of pure cacao, hand-picked, uncut, before the next calendar rotation. Until then, he must wear a woven sash marked with the symbol for shame. He walks home slowly. The sash itches. Justice is done. Maya justice was never just about rules. It was about relationship, between people, between cities, between humans and gods. It aimed not to isolate wrongdoers, but to reintegrate them, through payment, purification, and performance. It wasn't always fair, but it was communal. You sinned publicly. You were judged publicly. You made amends publicly. Then, perhaps, you are invited back to the feast. As you fall into stillness now, imagine the sounds of the Maya night. The chirp of frogs. The hush of wind through sabre trees. The low thump of distant drums. A market boy counting cacao beans under torchlight. And somewhere, a thief, rehabilitated, contrite, tending someone else's maize field until his debt is paid. Because in this world, justice is not a cell, It is a circle. Sleep well. We end our journey high in the Andes, among stone terraces, crisp mountain air, and the sound of sandals over gravel. Welcome to the Inca Empire, a civilization that managed to run a vast, multi-ethnic empire without coins, without wheels, and, most relevant to our topic, without written laws. Yes, there were no legal codes carved in stone, no scrolls, no contracts. And yet, somehow, the Inca state governed an empire that stretched across 2,500 miles of difficult terrain from modern-day Ecuador to Chile with impressive precision. There were taxes, courts, judges, and consequences for stealing a potato. It was a system built not on paperwork, but on oral tradition, surveillance, community pressure, and an almost supernatural obsession with organisation. Let's see how it all worked. At the heart of Inca law was the principle of Ailu, the extended community. You didn't live as an individual. You lived as part of a collective, a village unit that shared land, labour, and resources. Your behaviour wasn't judged just on what it cost the state, but on what it cost the group. And if you stepped out of line, your punishment wasn't always personal. Sometimes it was collective too. For example, if one person failed to meet their mitta, the rotating labour tax owed to the empire, the whole Ailu might suffer. They'd lose access to state seed stores, or get reassigned to less favourable land, or find themselves with fewer llamas to distribute in the spring. So when someone broke the rules, it wasn't the state they had to fear. It was their neighbours. Let's be clear, the Inca Empire had rules, lots of them. They were just memorised. The Incas were brilliant record keepers, but their system wasn't written in an alphabet. It was encoded in quipu, bundles of coloured strings with knots tied at specific lengths and positions. These knots recorded numbers, dates, census data, tribute obligations, and yes, crimes. Each province had a designated quipucamayok, a professional knot reader, who could decode these strings and report information to regional administrators. And if your name ended up in a quipu for the wrong reason, say hoarding state maize, or failing to show up for canal maintenance, it was as if the empire itself had caught you in a tangle of string. You might be summoned, or reassigned, or shaved bald and paraded around the plaza. Most crimes in Inca society were handled at the local level. Village elders and provincial officials held tribunals. These were not elaborate legal dramas. There were no lawyers, no cross-examinations. Just a few stern men sitting on woven mats, listening to complaints and watching body language very closely. If the dispute was about a field boundary, they'd consult oral maps. Stories passed down about where one plot ended and another began. If it was about a theft, they'd ask witnesses. And if no witnesses were found, then the accused would be required to swear an oath to the sun god Inti. Lying under oath was not simply dishonest, it was cosmically dangerous. The sun saw everything, and eventually the gods collected their debts. But the most terrifying feature of Inca justice wasn't divine judgment, it was the spy network. The Inca state operated a system of informants, often elderly locals, who observed daily life and reported suspicious activity. These were not men in black. These were little grandmothers who noticed that your family's corn harvest seemed a little too bountiful this year. They were called Tokoirikok, meaning he who sees all. They were not secret. Everyone knew they existed. That was the point. If you were cheating on your mitter labour, hiding surplus goods, or failing to show proper respect to a local official, chances were someone noticed. And if you thought you'd get away with it, well, perhaps you forgot that your fence leans against state land, and that's not a good place to plant cabbages. So, what happened when someone broke the law? The punishment varied, depending not just on the offence, but on who you were. Inca society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top stood the Sapa Inca, the divine ruler, said to be descended from the sun. Beneath him were nobles, priests, military officers, and administrators. Beneath them, artisans, farmers, and herders. And then, at the bottom, came the Yanakuna, state servants, and Mitmakuna, people forcibly resettled to different provinces. If a noble stole from the state, his punishment was public shaming or loss of status. Sometimes even execution, if the offence was large enough. But if a farmer stole from the storehouses, he might be forced to labour for free, or have his ear removed, or be marched through town with a heavy load of stones on his back, as others threw insults. The goal wasn't punishment. The goal was deterrence. Humiliation was efficient. Repetition was unnecessary. Interestingly, the Inca Empire didn't have prisons, not as permanent holding spaces. Why feed and house a criminal when you could simply shame them publicly, assign them additional labour, shave their head, and reassign their job? Or in serious cases, execute them swiftly. Murder, rebellion, and certain types of theft, especially from the state, could carry the death penalty. But even here, the punishment was practical. The sentence was carried out by a local authority. It was quick, clean, and usually followed by a small ceremony to restore cosmic balance. One might ask, how did the Incas prevent chaos without written laws? Simple. They didn't prevent it. They designed society to avoid it. Every household was registered, every farm assigned, every tool counted. The state knew who you were, where you lived, what you grew, how many blankets you had, and how many working hands were in your home. This wasn't invasive. It was normal. The empire took care of you, and you, in turn, followed the rules. You gave labour, you got clothing, you contributed to harvests, you received maize during droughts, and if you failed to contribute, then you no longer received. It wasn't cruelty. It was equation. Input equals output. No more, no less. The state storehouses, Tampu, were at the heart of this model. Every province maintained storage buildings filled with food, tools, textiles, and weapons. These were distributed during lean years, natural disasters, or war, but they were sacred. To steal from them was to steal from the gods. If you were caught pilfering maize or tampering with inventory, you could be executed, or worse, expelled from the Alu, left to wander without land, family, or name. You existed only through the state. Step outside it, and you cease to exist. Now let's imagine a day in Inca justice. A farmer is brought before the local administrator. His neighbour accuses him of undercounting his labour hours, claiming to be sick when he was secretly weaving baskets for private sale. The administrator listens. A Quipucamayok is summoned. The knots confirm inconsistencies. The farmer confesses. Not out of guilt, but out of exhaustion. He knows what comes next. His hair is shaved. He's sent to dig irrigation ditches for the next 3 weeks. His family receives no additional clothing that season. Justice has been served. Not with wrath, but with work. The Inca idea of justice was inseparable from the idea of social harmony. You didn't break the law so much as disturb the rhythm. Every person, every crop, every lemma had its place. The goal wasn't punishment. It was to put things back where they belonged. There's something quietly beautiful in that. And also mildly terrifying. Because if you didn't fit, the empire would not rage. It would not shout. It would simply correct. It's worth noting that, for all its structure, the Inca system could be cruel. Public executions, collective punishment, forced labour, state-sanctioned resettlement. And yet, from a certain angle, it also worked. Crime was low, famine was rare, infrastructure thrived, all without a single written law. Because when everyone is being watched, counted and redistributed, there's very little left to interpret. As you drift toward rest, picture the Inca road. A courier runs past, sandals kicking dust, carrying a quipu knotted with information. Perhaps a record of tribute, or a judgment from a provincial court. Above him, terraces climb the mountains. Storehouses rest beneath thatched roofs. A village elder smooths the grass in front of the council hut. Justice here is not a gavel. It's not even a word. It is a system. Invisible, constant, and quietly unavoidable. Sleep well. The room is dark, damp, and smaller than a stable. The air smells of soot, sweat, and something vaguely sour. A scent that clings to damp wool and tired skin. You don't remember the moment you're born. No one ever does. But you're told it happened quickly. Your mother screamed, your father paced, and the village midwife muttered prayers over your slippery head as she coaxed you into the world by candlelight. You arrive into a world already claimed by the church. Before your eyes can properly see, before your tiny mouth can form its first blasphemy, the priest is summoned. He's an old man with bowed legs, coarse fingers, and a fondness for ale and authority. He grumbles about the early hour, but arrives anyway, as he always does. Your parents know the rules. Infants must be baptized as soon as possible. The soul, they say, must not spend a single day outside the grace of God. The threat of limbo hangs like fog over the thatched roof. Water is drawn, cold, probably a bit dirty, and the priest traces the sign of the cross on your forehead. He mumbles Latin you don't understand and pours holy water over your scalp. It's more of a splash than a sprinkle. You cry. Everyone relaxes. That's a good sign. The priest declares your soul now belongs to God. Your mother clutches you, exhausted, while your father thanks the priest with a coin he can't afford to give. Just like that, you're no longer simply a child. You're a Catholic. The rite of baptism isn't optional in your world. It is the first ritual in a long string of obligations. The first link in the lifelong chain the church wraps around you, link by link, ceremony by ceremony. Without baptism, you are nothing. Worse than nothing. You are unsaved, unprotected, unacceptable. Should you die unbaptized, even before you've had the chance to sin, you'd be sent to a place neither heaven nor hell. A theological waiting room where souls simply linger. No one understands limbo fully, but everyone fears it. And in a village where death visits often and without warning, from fever, famine, or the wrong mushroom, there's no room for uncertainty. So you're baptized before your mother can even walk across the room. Your soul is washed clean before you ever had the chance to dirty it. They even pick your name from the saint's calendar. You weren't going to be named after your grandfather no matter what he thought. Your godparents stand behind you during the rite, looking solemn and mildly confused. Their duties are unclear but spiritually binding. Should your parents die, not unlikely given the mortality statistics, your godparents are expected to raise you in the faith. Not feed you or clothe you necessarily, but make sure you keep going to church. You wonder later in life if they'd have done it. Maybe. If the crops were good that year. As you grow, you notice that the church is not simply part of village life. It is village life. Its bell tolls set the rhythm of your days. Its calendar dictates when you can feast and when you must fast. Its priests are the only literate men in a world where even the local lord signs his name with a shaky X. The church knows what happens to your soul, how to cleanse it, how to charge for the cleansing, and exactly how guilty you ought to feel about everything. The wooden crucifix in your family's cottage looms large. Jesus, nailed, bleeding, sombre, watches your every movement from above the hearth. No one ever explains why the Son of God must always look like he's having a particularly rough afternoon. But the message is clear. Someone suffered for your sins, even if you haven't committed any yet. You learn early that guilt is a kind of inheritance. Like the family goat, it's just handed down whether you want it or not. When you begin to speak, your mother teaches you the Lord's Prayer before she teaches you to count. You learn it by rhythm, not meaning. You mumble it with your hands clasped and your eyes squinting, hoping the effort alone counts. Latin phrases are everywhere, carved into the church walls, muttered by the priest, embroidered into altar cloths. But you don't know what they mean. It's God's language, you're told, which means you're better off not understanding it. The first time you step into the church, you're too young to remember it. Your parents carry you in, freshly baptized, wrapped in linen, a spiritual receipt in your soul. But the first time you really remember going is on a cold morning, when the village fog hangs thick and your stomach is empty. The stone church is cold, the benches are hard, and the priest is somehow both quiet and long-winded. You sit still because you're supposed to, because God is watching, or because your father is. The church itself is the only stone building in the village. It smells of beeswax, mildew, and centuries of whispered fears. There are painted walls you can't read, and wooden statues that seem to stare back. Somewhere near the front, there's a carved scene of the Last Judgment, sinners tumbling into a monstrous mouth full of teeth and fire. You're too young to understand, but not too young to be scared. That's the point. The priest tells your father that fear of hell is healthy for children. It keeps them good. You wonder what kind of child needs nightmares to behave. Then again, you once tried to steal an apple from the Lord's orchard and tripped into the mud before you got 2 steps. Maybe God pushed you. As you begin to age, all of 5 or 6 winters, you start noticing more. The bells that signal Mass, the hush that falls when the priest enters, the way your parents stiffen when his gaze lands on them, the quiet mutter of penance after communion, whispered like someone's trying to fold a secret in half, and always, always the reminder that the church brought you into this world and will be there to usher you out. Even the days of rest are his. Sunday is not for lounging. It's for Mass, for kneeling, for long readings in a language no one in your family speaks. You learn the patterns anyway. When to sit, when to bow, when to look like you're praying, even if you're just wondering what's for supper. A small grumbling part of you wonders why heaven requires so many rehearsals. By the time you're old enough to do chores without supervision, you've already learned that God is everywhere. He's in the storms that drown the barley, in the silence after your mother coughs, and in the eyes of the priest who never blinks long enough. You hear whispers of saints and demons, relics and sins, indulgences and miracles. You don't understand most of it, but you don't question it either. That's what gets people burned. Still, there are moments of comfort. The way candlelight flickers against the stone walls. The soft chant of a hymn you don't know but feel anyway. The smell of bread at Easter Mass. The small mercy of being reminded, once in a while, that not everything sacred is terrifying. Some of it is just quiet, and kind, and warm. But those moments are rare. Most days, the church feels more like a gatekeeper than a shepherd. You are born into its arms, but also its grip. You begin to sense, even as a child, that this isn't a place you enter. It's a place that never leaves you. Baptism may have saved your soul, but it also marked you. A mark that says, you belong to us, forever. And when the priest looks at you during Sunday service, eyes unreadable beneath his drooping brow, you believe it. They say the soul is light as breath. But from the moment yours was dipped in holy water, it's carried a certain weight. Not evil, not cruel, just constant. A low pressure on the chest, a slow whisper in the ear. The church will guide you, judge you, punish you, and praise you, all in equal measure, and all from the moment you entered the world, born with nothing, baptized with water, owned by God. It begins with a mural. You're barely tall enough to see over the pew when your eyes first catch the twisted mass of bodies, flames, and teeth. Painted high on the wall, right above the altar, is a great gaping mouth, open wide, impossibly wide, with jagged yellow fangs stretching into shadows. Inside the mouth are people, hundreds of them, naked, screaming, clutching at each other, tumbling into the throat of a beast you've never seen in nature, but understand instinctively. This is what waits if you misbehave. Welcome to church. You tug on your mother's sleeve. She doesn't look. Everyone's facing forward. The priest's voice drones in Latin, a language that means something to God and absolutely nothing to you. But the painting makes its point without translation. Hell is real. It has a mouth, and you are precisely the right size to fit inside it. From that moment on, you see signs of damnation everywhere, in stone carvings, in stained glass, in wooden statues that seem to glare at you even when your eyes are shut. One particularly horrifying window shows a man being spit roasted by demons, who look as though they're enjoying their work far too much. Another sculpture near the door shows a soul being weighed against a feather, with a scowling devil ready to pounce should things go poorly. You've never felt so heavy in your life. Fear, you quickly learn, is part of the service. Hell isn't just a place, and it's a presence, a looming possibility, a word that makes grown men flinch and children sleep with one eye open. The priest doesn't avoid the subject. In fact, he rather enjoys it. He preaches of it regularly, painting pictures with his voice that rival the frescoes in detail. Fire that doesn't consume, pain that never ends, worms that feast forever. Eternal suffering. All because you coveted your neighbour's goat or rolled your eyes at your mother's stew. You start keeping a mental list of your sins. It grows quickly. The church teaches that even thoughts can condemn you. A wicked idea, no matter how brief or harmless, stains the soul. So when you catch yourself daydreaming during Mass, or muttering under your breath when you're told to scrub the floor again, you panic. You begin to confess things you're not even sure are sins, just to be safe. Once, you admitted to feeling annoyed when your sister chewed too loudly. The priest raised an eyebrow and added an extra prayer, just in case. Children in the village whisper about hell as though it's a neighbour who lives just beyond the woods. They share stories in low voices, of gluttons who are force-fed molten gold, of liars whose tongues are nailed to tables, of thieves who are buried alive in pits of ash. You aren't sure which stories come from Scripture and which from someone's older cousin, but it hardly matters. The images are sticky. They follow you into your sleep. And when you dream of fire. On feast days, mystery plays are performed in the village square. These are supposed to be educational, uplifting even, but somehow they always end with someone being dragged to hell by a man in red robes and a mask with horns. The devil in these plays is often the best actor. He struts, he grins, he sings. He's the only one who seems to be having any fun. Until, of course, he drags a merchant or a wayward nun into a painted pit, and the crowd gasps and clutches their crosses. You do too. Every time. One year, a player collapsed mid-performance. Heat stroke, someone said, and the rumour spread that it was divine punishment. He had mocked the devil too convincingly. The priest didn't confirm or deny it, which, as you've learned, is his favourite way to say yes. The worst part is how normal it all feels after a while. Hell becomes background noise, part of the rhythm of life, like frost in winter or blisters in summer. You accept it the way you accept the Lord's taxes or the smell of damp straw. Of course there's a hell. Of course it's full of flames and teeth and regrets. Of course it's waiting. What else would be at the end of such a hard life? And yet, amid the fear, there's a strange comfort in the certainty of it all. The rules are clear. Obey, confess, tithe, fast, stay in line, keep your soul clean, or at least scrubbed semi-regularly. The path is narrow, the priest says, but it leads to heaven. And if you wander, well, the mouth is still open. You start to notice the economics of damnation. There's a price for nearly everything. Sins can be absolved, time in purgatory shortened, eternal fire postponed, all for the right donation. Indulgences, they're called. Forgiveness, available for purchase. The wealthier villagers clutch parchment certificates, declaring their sins absolved in advance. You've seen one man smile with relief after paying for a sin he hasn't even committed yet. That, you think, is planning ahead. Your family can't afford such luxuries. You give what you can. Eggs, a length of twine, once even your father's belt. The priest accepts each offering with solemn gratitude, then gently remind you that salvation is a lifelong process, not a one-time transaction. You nod, ashamed, and wonder whether anyone in your house has ever truly been forgiven. The fear sharpens with age. As you grow older, you understand more of the sermons, and they only deepen the dread. Eternal torment, outer darkness, wailing and gnashing of teeth. One day you ask your mother what gnashing means. She demonstrates by clenching her jaw and grinding her teeth slowly. You don't ask again. Punishments, you notice, are tailored. The lazy are made to labour forever. The proud are broken, the impure are exposed. Every sin has its poetic inverse. Every weakness becomes a weapon. It's almost elegant, almost beautiful, almost. Even your surroundings seem built to remind you of judgment. Gargoyles leer from the church roof, their twisted faces frozen mid-scream. The stone floor is always just a little too cold. The incense, sweet as it is, masks something older, a scent of wax and bone and centuries of confession. And then there's the painting. Always the painting. No matter where you sit, that mouth is there, waiting. Once, in a moment of rare honesty, you ask your father if he believes in all of it, the fire, the demons, the eternal part. He doesn't answer at first, just stares into the fire. Then he says, "It doesn't matter whether it's real. What matters is that we believe it is." You don't ask again. The priest says that fear is the beginning of wisdom, that hell is a kindness really, a warning, a guide, a motivator, that without it people would sin freely, that with it we can be shaped into holy vessels. You look around at the people in your village, hollow-eyed, bent-backed, praying harder than they speak, and wonder what kind of vessels they've become. There are moments when you feel brave, when the sun is warm and the bread is fresh, and the meadow smells like thyme, when you laugh with your sister or hear bird song echo through the trees. You think, in those moments, that maybe hell isn't real, that maybe it's just a story to keep peasants pliant and children scared, but the feeling never lasts. A sermon, a shadow, a cold gust of wind, and the doubt melts away. You kneel again, you cross yourself again, you whisper your prayers in the dark, careful to include even the small sins, just in case. Because hell is a place of fire. Because hell is a place of truth. Because hell is the one thing you are sure is listening. And if it's not real, well, the fear still works just fine. You learn to give before you learn to speak. It starts with the clink of a coin in a wooden bowl. Your mother's hand shaking slightly as she parts with the only spare penny in the cottage. You're too young to understand what the offering is for. You think maybe it's a toll, like the one at the bridge, or payment for using the church's fire. It isn't until years later that someone explains, the church needs it. For candles, for wine, for your soul. Of course, your soul never asked for any of these things, but it's apparently the sort of guest who racks up a bill without mentioning it. Every Sunday, the bowl goes around. Sometimes it's a basket, sometimes a box. It doesn't matter. It comes to you all the same, slow, expectant, quiet as a tax collector with good posture. Everyone sees what you give, and what you don't. The shame of an empty hand, even when your pockets are empty too, is its own kind of punishment. They call it a tithe, a holy duty. 1/10 of everything you have, or as close as you can manage without starving. Livestock, grain, a sack of onions, it all counts. The local reeve keeps track of who's generous and who's merely obedient. Generosity, in this case, is defined by how uncomfortable the donation makes you. If your pantry still looks respectable afterwards, you didn't give enough. You come to understand that poverty doesn't exempt you, it brands you. The poor must give not in abundance, but in proportion to their lack. A rich man who gives a silver coin is admired. A poor man who gives his last turnip is considered saintly. Your family has learned to aim for something in between, respected but not canonized. Saints don't eat very well. The church doesn't just collect tithes, though. There are special contributions, penance payments, alms for the poor, alms for the monks, alms for the poor monks, collections for rebuilding the church roof, collections for painting a new Virgin Mary, collections for cleaning the old Virgin Mary. Every spiritual concern seems to have a matching fee. You suspect someone is keeping a very long tab. It doesn't stop at the doors of the church. When your uncle dies, your family is expected to offer a sole fee. A few coins paid to the priest to ensure his safe passage through purgatory. It's not mandatory, exactly, but no one wants to see what happens to an unpaid soul. The priest's prayers come slower when there's no silver on the altar. Later, when your cousin gets married, there's a fee for that too. A blessing doesn't come cheap. Love may be free, but the sacrament of holy matrimony costs exactly 6pence and a chicken. And then there are indulgences. You hear the word for the first time while eavesdropping on 2 older villagers near the well. They speak of parchment, wax seals, and a promise that sounds too good to be true. Sins forgiven in exchange for coin. It sounds like something a market huckster would shout from behind a cart, but when you ask the priest, he nods solemnly. Yes, he says. The Church, through its infinite mercy, offers forgiveness for donations of sufficient sincerity. And if your sincerity happens to be measured in shillings, well, who are we to question divine arithmetic? Indulgences become a quiet obsession in the village. People speak of them with envy and awe. A neighbour shows off his parchment like it's a relic, a declaration that his recent anger, gluttony, and unspecified travel behaviour are now forgiven. You can't read the Latin, but the seal looks official. He walks taller afterward. Your family cannot afford indulgences, but your father tries once, after a particularly severe illness, one that leaves him pale and shaking for days. He stumbles into the church with half a sack of barley and a carved token meant to resemble St. Cuthbert, though it mostly resembles a badger. The priest is polite. The offering is accepted. Your father says he feels lighter. He doesn't specify whether he means spiritually or because he gave away half his winter storage. You begin to grasp the logic. Guilt is a currency. Fear is an investment. And salvation is not unlike a transaction at the market. Everyone pays. The rich pay visibly. The poor pay painfully. The church also knows how to sweeten the deal. Once, a friar comes to your village selling relics. A splinter of the true cross, a scrap of the Virgin's veil, a bone that may or may not have belonged to St. Peter's donkey. Each comes with a price. Each promises blessings. People gather to touch them, to kneel, to murmur prayers. One woman weeps openly while holding what she's told is a vial of Christ's breath. You're not sure how one bottles a breath, but no one dares ask. The friar leaves 3 days later with a full satchel and a fresh horse. Even children aren't spared. You're taught from a young age to give what you can. A small coin, a portion of your bread, an hour of labour sweeping the church steps. It's good for your soul, they say. It builds character. And besides, you're lucky. Some children are given to the church, permanently. There's a family in your village who gave up their 3rd son to the monastery. Couldn't feed him, couldn't keep him. Now he's clean, fed, and reportedly very good at Latin. His mother cries every feast day. His father never speaks of it. When you pass the monastery on long walks, you glance at the walls and wonder if he thinks about the fields he left behind. Once, you ask the priest what the church does with all the things it collects. He smiles and gestures vaguely toward heaven. The Lord keeps accounts, he says. You nod, unsure whether that's a metaphor or an administrative procedure. Either way, the ledger seems to grow longer by the day. The church reminds you often that this life is temporary. That comfort now may cost you later. That it is better to suffer in this world than the next. It's a hard thing to hear when your boots are leaking and your stomach groans like a dying cow. But it's also oddly motivating. Misery becomes noble. Hunger becomes holy. And generosity, even if born from fear, is treated like virtue. Still, there are moments when the burden feels absurd. Like the time your mother dropped a coin meant for the offering plate and it rolled under the pew. She spent the entire Mass on her knees, not in prayer, but trying to reach it without drawing attention. She got it back eventually. It was given, polished with sleeve, with a trembling hand and an apology. You've never seen her look more devout. Or the time a neighbour brought an offering of eggs, only to have one break in the basket. The smell during communion was memorable. The priest insisted it was a lesson in humility. Others suggested the lesson was in reinforcing your baskets. Another time, the village baker attempted to give loaves made from last year's flour. The priest accepted them, but later reminded the congregation that the Lord prefers first fruits. The baker never made that mistake again. His next donation was fresh, soft, and notably missing from the shop shelves. There's humour in all of this, if only because the alternative is weeping. A sort of grim laughter shared among villagers who know the game is rigged but play it anyway. The church is the only path to salvation, and that path is lined with toll booths. You don't complain, you pay, you nod, you hope, because one day it will be your funeral. Your soul will hover, uncertain, and someone will stand at the altar with a coin in hand, a last payment, a final bribe, and you'd like that person to have something to offer, even if it means going hungry now. Even if it means handing over your last hen, your last hope, your last bit of pride. Because when heaven's gate is locked, you pray it's not your name that's missing from the guest list, but the donation. And you pray most of all that God accepts credit. You are 7 when you first shuffle into the dark wooden box at the side of the church. You've never been inside it before, but you've seen others go, and you've seen how they emerge after, quiet and small, eyes cast down, sometimes red-eyed, sometimes oddly peaceful. No one explains what you're meant to do, not properly, but it's your turn now, so in you go. The priest's voice seeps through the wooden lattice like wind through a cracked shutter. Speak, my child. You freeze. The silence stretches. Then you mumble something about stealing an egg, even though you're not sure you did. Maybe you thought about it. Or maybe you just watched someone else do it and didn't speak up. Either way, it's the best you've got. He sighs, long and low, and tells you to say 3 paternosters, 2 Ave Marias, and try not to let temptation win next time. You nod, even though he can't see you, and stumble out into the church's main hall, blinking as if you've emerged from a cave. Thus begins a lifetime of confession. You learn quickly that confession isn't just for murderers and thieves. It's for everyone. Everyone sins, even when they don't mean to, even when they don't understand how. You've heard that failing to fast properly on a feast day is a sin. Missing church is a sin. Speaking harshly to your mother is a sin. Thinking lustfully about the thatch roof girl with the crooked teeth might be the worst sin of all. And so you confess. week after week, sometimes with conviction, sometimes with imagination. Your village isn't particularly sinful if you measure it by violence or crime, but by church standards, it's positively writhing with corruption. Old Jorik the smith grumbles about indulgences again and again, but he still lines up with the rest of you for weekly penance. Ellen, the brewer's daughter, is in there so often you wonder if she rents space in the confessional. You once saw your father walk in looking stern and walk out looking hollow, like something had been wrung out of him behind that little screen. You're not supposed to talk about what's said in there, but everyone gossips anyway, and everyone lies, just a little. No one admits it, of course, but you know it happens. How could it not? Who wants to admit to envying a neighbour's plough? Who wants to say aloud they touched themselves beneath the hay when they were supposed to be hauling water? You once tried to confess a dream. You weren't sure it was a sin, but it felt like one. The priest told you dreams don't count unless you enjoy them too much. You're still not sure what that means. By the time you're old enough to understand Latin phrases and church teachings, at least the ones the priest decides are fit for a peasant's ears, you realise that confession isn't really about telling your sins. It's about feeling them. Regret, shame, guilt. These are the tools with which your soul is chipped into shape. The priest is just the sculptor. Or perhaps more accurately, the man who collects the chisel marks and reports them back to God. The confessional itself becomes oddly comforting. It's one of the few places in your life where you can speak without interruption, without judgment, or so they say. Though you often feel judged by the creak of the bench or the way the priest clears his throat when you admit something mildly scandalous. There was the time you said you harboured dark thoughts about kicking your neighbour's goose. The priest paused so long you thought he might call for backup. You begin to notice patterns. Some sins are met with a gentle nod and a quick penance. Pride, laziness, forgetting to say grace before supper. Others, like envy or impure thoughts, earn a slower voice, a more solemn tone, and sometimes a lecture. Anything to do with lust is treated as though it personally offended the Virgin Mary herself. And then there are the sins you didn't even know were sins until someone else got punished for them. Gossiping during Mass. Using the Lord's name while chasing a runaway pig. Missing a fast day because you didn't know it was a fast day. Each mistake is a reminder. The Church keeps the rule book, and it's updated regularly. Sometimes you run out of things to confess. It's a quiet week. No one's died, no one's fought. You haven't stolen or lusted or lied. And so you start inventing small things. You claim you were impatient with your sister. You muttered something rude about a local monk. Once, you confessed to taking more than your share of pottage, even though you gave half to a dog with sad eyes. Better to confess something than nothing. Better to appear sinful than to risk appearing arrogant. That too is a sin. Over time, your relationship with confession becomes complicated. You wonder how the priest knows what sins are truly worthy of fear and which are merely frowned upon. You wonder what he does with all that knowledge. Does he forget it instantly, wiping it away like dust on a windowsill? Or does he store it, stacking each whispered guilt in neat little piles inside his mind? You know he's just a man. You've seen him nod off during homilies. You've seen his boots patched with leather like everyone else's. Once, you saw him drinking ale behind the sacristy, cheeks pink and eyes glazed, and you wondered if he had someone to confess to. Sometimes, the confessional smells of beeswax and incense. Other times, it smells of sweat and damp wool. Always it smells like something old and private, like a place too used to secrets. You hear rumours of public confession in bigger towns, of sinners kneeling before whole congregations, sobbing their sins to rows of judgmental eyes. You thank whatever saint looks after small villages that yours doesn't practice such humiliation. Not yet, at least. When you're older, you learn about penance that isn't just prayers. There are stories of men forced to crawl on hands and knees to the altar, of women forbidden from speaking for a week, of entire families made to give up a prized pig to atone for a single misdeed. The weight of sin, it seems, can be measured in livestock as well as sorrow. And yet, despite all this, the shame, the guessing games, the occasional creative embellishments, you keep going. Every week, every season, every year. Because no matter how tiresome it gets, no matter how repetitive or surreal or uncomfortable it feels to murmur a litany of personal failings into the ear of a man who once farted during Vespers, you're afraid not to. Because if you stop confessing, your sins will pile up. And if they pile up too high, they'll drag your soul down. That's what you're told. That's what you believe. And maybe, just maybe, there's comfort in the ritual. In knowing that no matter how muddy your boots, how flawed your thoughts, how foolish your heart, there's always a booth waiting and a man behind a screen who'll offer you a few words, a few prayers, and a chance to try again. Even if you're not sure what you did wrong in the first place. The miracle begins, as many do, with a whisper. You're out mending the fence that barely keeps the goats from eating your neighbour's turnips when word spreads. The statue of the Virgin in the chapel down the road has wept. Not just moisture. Tears. Real tears, they say. Wet, glistening, human tears rolling down her cheek. You pause, squinting into the sun. Is it true? Does it matter? You feel your legs begin to walk before your mind catches up. In a village with few excitements and even fewer diversions, a weeping statue is cause for a pilgrimage, even if that pilgrimage is only half a mile. By the time you arrive, the chapel is crowded. Everyone seems to be leaning inward, craning necks, stepping on each other's toes for a glimpse of the miraculous. The air smells of hay, breath, and incense. Someone's lit a furrable, swinging smoke, like it'll help make sense of it all. You can't get close enough to see the tears yourself. A man swears they've dried up. A woman says she saw them with her own eyes, clear as spring water. Someone else says they weren't tears but blood. Another insists it was oil, sweet and fragrant like pressed olives from the Holy Land. The statue just stands there, as stony and unbothered as ever. Still, a miracle is a miracle. Whether you saw it or not hardly matters. The priest is already speaking about how it's a sign, a warning perhaps of sin in the village, or maybe a blessing for the faithful who've remained pure. It depends on the sermon. It always does. Miracles, you find, are rarely convenient things. They tend to arrive when people are already hungry, or tired, or busy. They demand attention, devotion, a bit of coin for the poor box, and sometimes a candle you can barely afford. But no one dares question them aloud. That would be impious, disrespectful, dangerous even. And yet, inside you, the doubt creeps in like a draft through the chapel door. the Church has always traded in the wondrous. From saints who levitate to relics that glow, medieval Christendom was built on more than just scripture. It was built on spectacle. In an age where literacy was rare and science was indistinguishable from sorcery, these wonders were not only believed, but expected. You remember your uncle swearing that St. Margaret once helped his cow give birth after a desperate prayer. He said he saw a glowing light in the barn, right above the hay, and then, miracle of miracles, the calf slid out, healthy and bawling. You also remember your uncle was drunk for most of Lent, but even the sober speak of such things, of saints who bled for the sins of others, of monks who healed with a touch, of bones that never decayed. The stories grow with each telling, details added like seasoning to pottage, just enough to make them palatable. You once saw a traveller arrive with a splinter of the true cross. He kept it in a little glass tube, sealed with wax and surrounded by gold filigree. He said it came from Rome, and that the Pope himself had blessed it. For a small donation, you could kiss it and receive a full indulgence from minor sins. A few women wept. One man fainted. You gave 2 pennies and tried not to think too hard about where one might find that many splinters of a single cross. The relic trade is booming, or so they say. Every church wants one. A sliver of bone, a drop of blood, a sandal worn by a saint, a tooth, a finger, even a feather from the angel Gabriel himself. Some relics sit in fine reliquaries of silver and gold. Others are wrapped in cloth and kept in locked boxes, only brought out on feast days. You once queued for 3 hours to see the severed hand of St. Alban. It looked suspiciously like a chicken wing, but no one said so. Miracles, of course, are good for business. They draw crowds. Crowds bring offerings. Offerings mean candles are lit, incense burned, and the coffers of the church jingle with a bit more weight. A weeping statue here, a healing spring there. It all feeds the machine of faith. But there's a deeper reason the church needs miracles. You see, they're proof. Tangible evidence that heaven still watches, still intervenes, still punishes and forgives. For people like you, who live in a world of mud and toil, who bury half their children before they can walk, who bleed and sweat and break, miracles are hope. Shaky, flickering hope, like the flame of a votive candle in a wind-blown chapel. And so you learn not to ask questions. Not out loud, not in front of the priest. Certainly not near the bishop. You nod solemnly when a tale is told. You make the sign of the cross. You whisper your prayer. And if your eyes drift to the statue's dry cheeks, and your mind wonders whether it ever truly wept, you scold yourself and look away. Sometimes, at night, you stare at the ceiling of your hovel and think about St. Cuthbert, who was said to have turned back the sea with his staff, or St. Julian, who cured a man of leprosy with a kiss. You think about the girl from 2 villages over who claimed the Virgin appeared to her in the forest and gave her a silver coin. You think about whether it matters if the stories are true, if the results are the same. Because faith, you learn, is a kind of bargain. You give your trust, your labour, your coin, your children. In return, the church gives you meaning, structure, a path to heaven, and the occasional miracle to reassure you that it's all real, that your suffering isn't wasted, that someone, somewhere, sees you. Once, during a particularly bad year, the crops rotted, the rain came late, and your cousin died of something that made his skin blacken. You saw another miracle, or thought you did. A bird flew into the chapel during Mass, circled the altar, and then vanished. Vanished, not out the window or through the door, but right in mid-air. That's what you told yourself. That's what others said too. The priest claimed it was a sign from God. A good one, he said, and then he asked for donations. You gave a copper penny and a sideways glance. Later, while hauling water, you confessed to your neighbour that you weren't sure the bird vanished. Maybe it had flown into the rafters. Maybe you were imagining things. He didn't respond. Just gave you a look. A very particular look. And you realised it was better to keep such thoughts to yourself. Not long after, that same neighbour came down with a fever. His wife swore she saw St. Michael standing at the foot of his bed, sword drawn. He recovered. Slowly, but he recovered. Another miracle. You didn't say a word. Because in the end, doubt is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout, doesn't argue. It just sits beside you, unnoticed by most, like a tired dog at your feet. You may not feed it, but it's always there. And so you live with miracles. You nod and bow and cross yourself when they happen. You light your candles. You touch the relics. You listen to the tales of weeping statues, glowing bones, and saints who walk among the barley fields in the moonlight. You believe mostly. Enough to get by. Enough to sleep at night. Because even if the miracles are false, the hope they offer is real. And that, you think, might be miracle enough. You don't remember deciding to give your child to the church. Not exactly. There wasn't a moment with trumpets and candles where you handed him over like a loaf of bread on the altar. It was slower than that. Like water creeping through a crack in the wall. It just happened. The idea was planted early, when he was still small enough to sleep on your chest. Such a good child, the priest said one day. So quiet, so obedient. A soul like that would do well in God's house. You nodded, unsure what he meant. But the seed was sown. By the time your boy was old enough to feed chickens and trip over his own feet in the fields, the whispers were louder. You've too many mouths, the neighbour said, not unkindly. And the monastery needs novices. It was framed as kindness, as opportunity. One less child to clothe. One more soul aimed at heaven. A chance for him to rise above the muck. So you agreed. You said yes without ever really thinking no was an option. The day he left was overcast. Not dramatically, not like a storybook. Just grey. You dressed him in his best tunic, such as it was, and tried not to cry as you tied the belt. He asked if he'd be allowed to keep his wooden toy, the one you carved for him last Yule. You said no, the monks didn't allow toys. He nodded and looked down at the floor. The priest came for him at dawn. He smiled broad and warm, like this was a wedding instead of a goodbye. Your son walked beside him, small and silent, clutching a sack of bread and your wife's handkerchief. You told yourself it was the right thing. You told yourself it was God's will. You told yourself again and again that he would have a better life than you ever could. But it didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like loss. In the monastery, he would rise before the sun. He would chant psalms in a language he didn't understand, eat in silence, and sleep on hard boards with no fire. He would scrub floors, copy texts, and learn to fear sin in 50 new forms. If he was lucky, he'd become a monk. If not, he'd serve until his back broke and his hands curled with age, and then be buried beneath cold stone. You weren't allowed to visit. The church said detachment was holy. That love must be surrendered, like everything else, so you stayed away. But at night, when the wind howled through the cracks in your cottage, you whispered his name. You wondered if he was warm, if he missed your cooking, poor as it was, if he still remembered the lullaby your wife sang when the snow came early. Sometimes, late at night, you wonder what he dreams about now. Does he remember the village square, the feel of bare feet on packed earth, the sting of a switch when he teased the chickens? Or are his dreams filled with Latin verse and the echo of cloisters, dreams shaped by walls too smooth to climb and rules too numerous to question? In the early weeks after he leaves, you half expect to hear his voice outside the door, to see him running across the field, arms flailing, wild-eyed with regret. But it never happens. The church does not return what it claims. It sanctifies, isolates, and reforms. You've seen it before. Boys who left laughing come back years later, with flat voices and downcast eyes, their fingers moving unconsciously over rosary beads, as if afraid to forget. And there's something else that gnaws at you, deep in the marrow of your days. The sense that this wasn't truly your choice, that perhaps it never was. When the priest speaks, you nod. When he smiles, you agree. When he invokes God's will, you lower your gaze and fold your hands. Because the church doesn't need to force you with whips. It only needs to make you believe that saying no would be a sin. You begin to understand, in the quiet hours, how deeply this power runs. It's not just in the altar or the sermon. It's in the silence of every parent who lets go. It's in the hollow space at your table where a child used to sit, and no one dares speak their name. It's in the way your wife folds that one extra tunic and then tucks it away, even though no one will wear it again. The priest visits a week later, smiling as always, speaking softly about God's mercy and how well your son has settled in. A natural, he says, obedient, curious. He seems pleased, as if he's just acquired a new goat with excellent temperament. You nod and murmur a blessing, and pretend it's enough. But a small part of you wants to ask, does he cry? Does he ask about us? Does he wish he'd said goodbye? Instead you offer bread. Thin, crusty, inadequate. The priest takes it without hesitation. That too is the way of things. Seasons pass. Your son's absence becomes part of the rhythm. At times you almost forget what his voice sounded like. Then you'll hear his younger brother mutter something in the same cadence, and your chest will tighten for reasons you don't explain. The village moves on. Another child is given over to the church. This one from the miller's family. A girl this time. People talk. Some say it's a blessing. Others, in hushed tones, say it's convenient. The line between faith and desperation is not always so easy to spot when both wear the same vestments. You sometimes wonder if the saints ever miss their families, or if sainthood requires forgetting where you came from. And then, years later, perhaps 5, perhaps 10, a monk returns to bless the fields. He walks slowly with purpose, a man clearly not made for mud, but determined to walk through it anyway. You recognize the curve of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. But his voice is strange. It rolls like scripture, not like story. He speaks of God's bounty and the price of sin, and you listen, but your mind keeps wandering to a scar on his wrist. You know that scar? You remember when he got it climbing the old tree near the pond. He doesn't acknowledge you. He probably doesn't even know who you are. Or maybe he does, and that's worse. The church says it gave him a life of meaning. You gave him to the church, and neither of you will say aloud what was taken. In time, you stop praying that he'll return. Instead, you pray he's warm. You pray he's safe. You pray that when he lights a candle in the chapel, a small part of the flame remembers your hearth. Because no matter what they say about piety, obedience, and the glory of sacrifice, the truth is simpler and quieter. You loved your child. You still do. And even if you would make the same choice again, that doesn't make the ache go away. That is the miracle the church never mentions. Not weeping statues or glowing relics, but the quiet, stubborn